The cage was real. Rusted iron bars sunk into cracked Montana earth, half swallowed by dead grass and silence. Inside, a child, 6 years old, barefoot, sitting perfectly still while two dogs pressed their bodies against the bars from the outside, watching the empty road like soldiers who'd never been relieved of duty. She wasn't crying. That was the part that broke him. A man who had pulled bodies out of burning vehicles in 3 different countries. A man who had decided long ago that he was too damaged to feel anything for anyone. Stopped his motorcycle on that empty highway and heard something he wasn't prepared for. A little girl humming to herself, like the world was fine. Like she'd always lived this way. If this story hits you somewhere deep, stay with it all the way to the end. Hit that like button, leave a comment, and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to know where this story found you. Now let's go back to where it all began. The highway had no name worth remembering. Route 9 North cut through the forgotten belly of northern Montana the way an old scar cuts through skin. Functional, permanent, and completely indifferent to the damage it marked. In late October, the land on both sides of that road turned the color of dried bone. The grass lay flat and brown under a sky the shade of dirty pewter. Power lines sagged between leaning poles. The occasional mailbox marked a driveway leading nowhere visible. Wind moved constantly across the plains, not violent, not dramatic, just relentless, the way loneliness moves through a man who's been alone long enough to stop noticing it. Ronan Voss had been riding this stretch of highway for 3 years running, not because it led anywhere useful, not because anything waited for him at the end of it. He rode it because motion was the only thing that quieted the frequency in his skull, the particular pitch of a mind that had seen too much and processed almost none of it. At 46, Ronan moved through the world like a man conserving fuel, measured, deliberate, the kind of stillness that gets mistaken for peace by people who don't know the difference. He was not at peace. His Harley was a 2004 Road King, dark navy fading toward black, chrome dulled by 10,000 miles of weather. The saddlebags were worn soft. A bedroll was strapped across the back. The leather vest he wore over a heavy canvas jacket bore 2 patches, one marking his chapter of the Iron Vow Brotherhood, a motorcycle club operating out of Billings that most people in the region knew nothing about, and one small rectangular patch near the bottom that read Combat Medic in faded white letters. He'd earned the second one before the first. In that order, the sequence mattered. He'd spent 4 years in the Army and another 2 as a civilian contractor doing medical support in places Congress periodically pretended weren't happening. He'd come home at 32 with both eardrums slightly damaged, a left knee that forecast rain more reliably than any weather service, and a recurring dream in which he was always arriving somewhere 30 seconds too late. He'd been in therapy twice. Both times he'd sat in the chair, answered questions honestly, and felt absolutely nothing shift. He wasn't hostile toward the process. He just suspected the damage lived somewhere language couldn't reach. The Iron Vow Brotherhood had found him 6 years ago through a mutual contact, a veteran outreach coordinator in Billings who knew that some men couldn't be reached through traditional channels, but could sometimes be reached through chrome and leather, and the particular fraternity of men who'd decided the conventional world was not a place they fully belonged. Ronan had attended one ride, then another. He hadn't joined out of loyalty or philosophy. He'd joined because for the first time in years he'd been in a room full of people and not felt the urgent need to locate the nearest exit. That was enough. The chapter had 12 full members and a rotating cast of associates. They ran a legitimate mechanic shop out of a converted warehouse on the south side of Billings and did occasional contract security work for events and private clients who valued discretion. They were not saints. Several had histories that wouldn't survive close legal scrutiny, but they operated by a code that Ronan had come to recognize as more functional than most. You protected people who couldn't protect themselves, you kept your word, and you did not, under any circumstances, harm a child or a woman. Those rules weren't written anywhere. They didn't need to be. They lived in the way men spoke to each other, in the jobs they took and the ones they refused. On the afternoon of October 14th, Ronan was 40 miles out of a town called Dunn Creek when he saw the dogs. He almost didn't stop. He was tired in the particular way that follows a poor night's sleep after a long night of thinking, and he'd been riding for 6 hours with one 30-minute break. His knee was sending its usual advisory reports. His coffee thermos was empty. He had another 80 miles to cover before the chapter's weekend gathering in Billings, and he was already running late in the way that men like him run late. Not dramatically, not apologetically, just quietly and consistently. But the dogs stopped him. Two of them, standing near a collapsed fence line on the right shoulder of the highway. One was a large mixed-breed animal, some kind of shepherd cross, tawny and barrel-chested, standing absolutely motionless at the edge of the road. The other was smaller, lighter in color, lying in the grass with one hind leg extended at a wrong angle. Not whimpering, not moving, just breathing in the shallow, measured way of an animal conserving everything it had left. Ronan pulled off the road. He'd done trauma medicine on animals before. Livestock mostly, once a police K-9 in a situation he didn't talk about. And the instinct that fired now wasn't emotional. It was procedural. Injured animal, possible road strike, assess the leg, assess the airway, determine whether transport was viable. He cut his engine and swung off the bike with the unhurried efficiency of a man who'd learned that panic wasted time. The large dog moved the moment Ronan's boot touched the gravel. Not aggressively. It didn't lunge or bark. It simply repositioned itself between Ronan and the injured animal with a precision that suggested training rather than instinct. The dog's eyes tracked him without blinking. Old eyes in a young face, the kind of eyes that had learned to measure everything and trust nothing. Ronan stopped walking. He crouched down, bringing himself to the dog's eye level. He'd learned this from a veterinarian he'd dated briefly in his late 30s. The importance of reducing your profile around traumatized animals, removing the physical dominance of standing height, allowing the animal to recalibrate its read of you. He stayed very still. He let the dog look at him. "Not moving," he said quietly. "Just looking." The dog didn't relax exactly, but some minute tension in its shoulders shifted, barely perceptible. Enough. The wind off the plains was cold and consistent, dragging dead grass across the gravel shoulder with a sound like something being erased. In the distance, the sky had gone darker in the northwest. Weather coming. Maybe 3 hours out. Ronan was cataloging this automatically. Route options, shelter, time. When he became aware of something else. A sound. Not from the dogs. From somewhere behind the ruined fence line. He'd registered the old ranch structure in his peripheral vision when he pulled over. A collapsing farmhouse, about 60 yards back from the road. The kind of building that had been losing its argument with Montana weather for at least 2 decades. The roof sagged. The windows were blind with grime and broken plastic sheeting. A rusted water tower leaned at an architectural angle that defied easy explanation. The property looked abandoned in that deep way. Not recently vacated, but genuinely surrendered. The sound coming from beyond that fence was a child's voice. Not screaming, not calling for help. Humming. A tuneless, looping melody with no clear beginning or end, the kind of sound a child makes when they've learned to fill silence with themselves because nothing else is available. Ronan had heard something like it exactly once before, in a village in a country he'd signed papers agreeing not to name, from a small boy sitting in rubble 6 hours after everyone around him had stopped surviving. The boy had been humming the same way, self-contained, unreachable, generating a small private warmth in conditions that had no warmth left. It was one of the sounds Ronan still heard in the middle of certain nights. He stood slowly. The large dog, he would later learn its name was Scout, watched him with that same unblinking assessment. When Ronan took a slow step toward the fence line, Scout moved with him, not blocking him now, moving alongside, as if making a decision. Ronan walked through a gap in the collapsed fence where a gate had once hung, stepping carefully over rusted wire. The grass on the other side was tall enough to reach his thighs in places, brown and thick, and it hissed against his jeans as he pushed through it. Behind him he could hear Scout following, and faintly the labored breathing of the smaller dog. Briggs, though he didn't know that yet, attempting to move despite the injured leg. He almost told the hurt dog to stay put. He didn't. Somehow it seemed wrong to give that order. The humming grew clearer as he moved toward the side of the farmhouse. It was coming from behind the structure, and when Ronan rounded the corner of the building, stepping past a collapsed porch, where a wooden chair had been slowly returning to the earth for years, he saw it. The enclosure was perhaps 8 feet by 10, built from welded iron livestock panels, the heavy gauge type used for cattle or large hog operations. The bars were thick. The construction was serious, the work of someone who understood metal and load-bearing and permanence. It had been partially covered with a heavy-duty tarpaulin on the north and west sides, blocking wind. Inside the tarp's shelter, a large folded blanket had been arranged in one corner with the careful geometry of someone who organized small spaces with great intention. There were 2 water containers, a sealed plastic bin, a lantern with a battery pack that had been switched off, and sitting in the center of the enclosure, cross-legged on the blanket, was a child. She was small even for 6, which Ronan wouldn't know her age for another 3 days. Her hair was the particular tawny brown of autumn grass, tangled at the ends, pulled back imperfectly with what looked like a shoelace. She wore a wool sweater 2 sizes too large, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows, and heavy corduroy pants above bare feet. The feet stopped him for a moment. Not their dirtiness, though they were dirty, but their stillness. She'd arranged them neatly under her knees, ankles tucked, the posture of a child who had learned to keep herself contained. She was not crying, she was watching him. Her eyes were gray, a particular shade of northern gray that matched the October sky overhead, and they held the same quality as Scout's, old in a face too young, careful in the way of someone who has learned that new things in the environment are information to be assessed, not welcomed. She didn't speak. She didn't scramble backward or press herself against the far bars or make any of the sounds a frightened child might make. She simply looked at him with those careful gray eyes and waited to see what he would do. Scout moved to the bars of the enclosure and pressed its broad head against them, positioning itself between the child and Ronan's side of the cage. Then the smaller dog, Briggs, dragging its injured leg, having followed them all the way from the road with an effort that visibly cost it, made it to the enclosure and collapsed against the base of the bars on the child's side, pressing its flank against the iron as close to her as the bars would allow. The girl looked down at Briggs. Something moved in her face. A loosening, a relief so quiet it was almost invisible. She reached through the bars and placed her hand against Briggs's side. Ronan stood very still. He had a disassembled first aid kit in his right saddlebag and a more serious trauma kit in his left, carried by habit and professional compulsion for 12 years running. He had a multi-tool, water, enough food for 2 days. He was, by training and inclination, a person equipped to address physical emergencies. He had absolutely no protocol for this. He didn't crouch down immediately. He stood at what he calculated was a non-threatening distance, about 15 feet, and simply let her see him. All of him. The gray beard that had grown long enough to require a loose braid in windy conditions, the scarred hands, the vest with its 2 patches, the size of him, because he was a large man and had been since his early 20s, and there was no making himself smaller than he was. He let her read all of it. After a long moment, he said very quietly, "I'm not going to come any closer." The girl looked at him, said nothing. "Your dog's leg is hurt," he said. "I'm a medic. I can look at it, if that's okay." The girl looked down at Briggs, then back at Ronan. Then, in a voice so small he nearly missed it under the wind, "Will it hurt her more?" It was the voice of a child who had thought about this before asking, considered the angles. "Might hurt for a moment while I look," Ronan said. "Then less." The girl was quiet for a moment. She kept her hand against Briggs's flank through the bars. Then she said, "Okay." Ronan crouched down and opened his trauma kit. He worked on Briggs for 40 minutes, speaking in a low, even voice throughout. Not to the girl exactly, not to the dog exactly, but into the space between them, narrating what he was doing and why. The leg was not broken. There was soft tissue damage, a deep laceration on the inner thigh that had bled and partially clotted, and significant swelling around the stifle joint. He cleaned and dressed the wound with the supplies he had. He couldn't do more than that without X-ray confirmation, but he could stabilize, clean, and reduce the immediate risk of infection. He did all 3. Scout watched him the entire time. The girl watched him the entire time. When he was finished, Briggs let out one long exhale and rested her chin on the ground and closed her eyes, the particular relaxation of an animal that had been bracing against pain and has now been allowed to stop. Ronan sat back on his heels. "What's your name?" he asked. A pause. "Ren?" "I'm Ronan." She seemed to consider this. "Why do you have a bird name?" "I don't think Ronan is a bird name." "Wren is," she said. "A wren is a bird." "You're right about that." Silence. Wind moved through the grass. The clouds to the northwest had darkened another shade. "Where's the person you live with?" Ronan asked. The answer didn't come immediately. When it came in pieces. "He went." "When did he go?" "A long time." "How long?" She looked at the sky the way children look at things they're trying to measure. "Before the cold came back," she said. It was October now. The cold had come back approximately 3 weeks ago. Ronan felt something move through his chest that he didn't immediately have a name for. He'd learned not to trust his first reads of his own emotional states. They were frequently wrong, frequently delayed, frequently arriving under disguise. He let the feeling sit there unexamined and focused on the immediate practical inventory. A child, alone, in a locked enclosure, for a period measured in weeks. 2 dogs. Food and water that suggested someone had prepared for this possibility. No signs of visible malnutrition. The girl was thin, but not catastrophically, and her color was reasonable. The tarpaulin shelter indicated the enclosure had been designed for habitation, however misguided. She was cold, but not hypothermic. She was dirty, but not injured. "Is there a lock?" he asked. "Yes." "Do you know where the key is?" "I don't want to come out," she said. He looked at her. She said it without defiance, without distress, as a fact about herself. The same tone she'd used to identify the word Wren. "Okay," he said. He didn't push it. He sat there for another 20 minutes as the light changed and the temperature dropped and the wind picked up. He talked about nothing in particular. The drive he'd taken, the highway, the way the sky looked when weather was coming in from the northwest. Not asking anything from her, not requiring a response, just filling the air with a human voice that wasn't demanding something. Before he left, he went back to his bike and brought her everything he had that could be useful. 3 protein bars, a sealed bottle of water, a folded emergency blanket from the kit in his left saddlebag, a wool hat he'd been carrying since September. He passed these items through the bars of the enclosure with the same careful, deliberate movements he'd learned to use with traumatized patients who were technically conscious, but operating somewhere between the present moment and somewhere else entirely. She accepted each item with both hands and a small thank you that was formal enough to suggest she'd been taught it, but quiet enough to suggest she wasn't sure it still applied. He looked at Scout. "Take care of her," he said. Scout looked back at him with those old eyes. Then Ronan walked back to his bike, strapped in, and rode toward Billings. He didn't make the chapter gathering. He pulled into a diner in a town called Brecker, 40 miles east, and sat at the counter with a cup of coffee he didn't drink for an hour and a half, staring at the rain that had begun to fall against the windows, while a television above the counter cycled through local news and weather and a rerun of something none of the 3 other customers were watching. He tried to identify the feeling in his chest. He still couldn't name it, but it had mass. It had weight. It sat there in the center of him the way heavy objects sit, not threatening to move, not asking to be acknowledged, just present in a way that couldn't be ignored. He paid for the coffee he hadn't drunk and went to find a motel. He came back the next morning. He'd told himself on the drive back that this was a professional obligation, that he had a duty to assess the child's condition and ensure she was either stable or appropriately reported. That was the medic's logic. The logic of the man who always arrived, even when he arrived too late. He'd run through the protocols in the motel room at 3 a.m. while rain hammered the parking lot outside. Call it into child services, report what he'd found, let the system handle what the system existed to handle. He knew what the system would do. He'd seen it before, not identically, but recognizably. The machinery of institutional response, the forms and assessments and placements and temporary solutions that moved people through processes without ever quite landing them anywhere real. He'd seen it with veterans who fell through the gaps between agencies. He'd seen it with families in the communities adjacent to where the Iron Vow Brotherhood operated. The system was not malicious, it was insufficient. Those were different problems that produced similar outcomes. He came back with food this time. Real food. A thermos of oatmeal he'd made in the motel room's coffee machine in a way that technically violated the coffee machine's intended purpose. A bag of apples, cheese crackers, beef jerky. Dog food from a gas station 20 miles back, the decent kind in a sealed bag, and 3 dog biscuits that the cashier had added when she'd seen what he was buying and not asked any questions about where he was going. Wren was in exactly the same position when he arrived, cross-legged, hands folded in her lap, as if she'd been waiting in the specific way of someone who'd learned that waiting was the primary activity available to them. Briggs was on her feet, gingerly, leg wrapped in Ronan's bandage. The wound looked clean. Scout was at the edge of the road, facing the highway, maintaining the same watch post it had occupied the previous day. The girl watched Ronan park the bike. She watched him walk through the fence gap. She watched him approach and crouch down with the food. "Oatmeal," he said. "Probably terrible. I made it in a coffee machine." She looked at the thermos with an expression of careful neutrality. "That sounds wrong." "It is wrong, but it's hot." He passed it through the bars. She held the thermos in both hands and something in her face shifted, barely, just the smallest closing of her eyes and the smallest exhale, at the warmth against her palms. She'd been cold. She'd been cold for longer than one night, and she hadn't said so, and she wouldn't have said so because she'd learned not to announce her needs to the available air. He recognized this. He'd spent years doing exactly the same thing. While she ate, he looked at Scout. "How long has she been alone?" he asked. The dog looked at him. He didn't expect an answer. He wasn't entirely sure why he kept addressing the animals directly. Some residue of isolation, maybe. Some habit from nights in forward operating bases when conversation with humans carried weight and consequence, and the dogs attached to units offered a neutral companionship that cost nothing. He was going to have to make some decisions. That afternoon, he found the journal. It was on the farmhouse porch, or what remained of the farmhouse porch, tucked between 2 boards near the door in the manner of something placed deliberately, protected from rain by the remnant of an overhang. A composition notebook, the black and white kind, cover warped and swollen from weather, but the interior pages surprisingly intact, having been shielded by the boards and the angle of the roof above. Ronan sat on the porch step and read it. The man's name had been George Holloway. He'd started the journal in what appeared to be late spring, though the dates were sometimes absent. He wrote in the irregular rhythm of a man who came to the page when driven to it, not on schedule. The handwriting was large and slightly unsteady, the writing of someone who'd been educated in an era that valued penmanship, but whose hands had spent more time on machinery than on paper in the intervening decades. The early entries were practical, records of what food was stored where, what the well situation was, notes about the dog's feeding schedules, a list of emergency contact numbers in the back, all of them crossed out with a single line, crossed out the way you cross out something that has become inapplicable. The middle entries were different. George Holloway had been 73 and had known, with the particular clarity of a man whose body has begun to announce its own timeline, that he was running out of time. He'd raised Wren alone for 4 years following the death of his daughter, Wren's mother, lost to something the journal only referred to obliquely, in the manner of grief that has been lived with long enough to become an architecture rather than an event. The girl's father was not mentioned. There was no other family within reach, no one willing, no system he trusted. He'd built the enclosure himself. This was the part Ronan read twice. George Holloway had not built the enclosure as a prison. He'd built it as a solution to a problem that had kept him awake for months. The problem of what happened to Wren if he was working and she wandered. The ranch was adjacent to wilderness. There were ravines, there was water, there were the particular dangers of a Montana landscape that didn't make allowances for 6-year-olds. He'd lost a dog to a ravine 3 years prior. He'd spent a month after that rethinking every calculation he had. The enclosure had locks on both sides. Wren had a key. She could get out. The journal said this clearly. She chose not to. She'd chosen the cage. Because the cage was where the dogs were. Because the cage was the place that felt most like the thing she understood as home. Because she was 6 years old and the largest world she'd ever known was the space between those rusted bars, and the idea of the space beyond them, without Grandpa George, who had been the entire definition of safe, was simply not a thing she could form a plan around. The final entry in the journal was dated 6 weeks earlier. It was very short. George Holloway had written it in a shakier hand than the rest. He'd written, "I have to trust that someone will come. Not a stranger, a person. Someone with enough broken in them to understand what they're looking at." That was all. Ronan closed the notebook and sat on the porch step for a long time. The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere behind the farmhouse, Wren was humming. He called Billings. Not child services. Not yet. He called a woman named Patricia Cross, who worked with a family advocacy nonprofit that the Iron Vow Brotherhood had done security work for twice. A short, relentless woman in her 50s who'd spent 3 decades navigating the space between what families needed and what institutions could offer. She listened to everything he said without interrupting, which was a quality he'd learned to identify as rare and trustworthy. When he finished, she said, "Don't call the county directly. Let me make some calls first." "Why?" "Because if you call the county directly, they'll send someone tomorrow morning who will look at an enclosure and see a cage, and that's where the paperwork starts. And once the paperwork starts, the outcome is determined by the paperwork and not by what's actually in front of anyone. And if you call first, I can get someone there who'll actually look," she said. "Give me 24 hours." He gave her the 24 hours. That night he slept in his bedroll on the farmhouse porch. It was 41 degrees by midnight. He'd slept in worse. He lay there listening to the wind and to Wren's occasional movements inside the enclosure and to the sounds of the dogs. Scout's alert, intermittent wakefulness. Briggs's deeper, healing sleep. And he thought about George Holloway sitting on this same porch, writing in a composition notebook about trust. A person with enough broken in them to understand what they're looking at. He didn't sleep much. In the morning, Wren was awake before him. She was sitting at the bars nearest the porch, knees pulled up, watching him in his bedroll with an expression that might have been curiosity and might have been something more complicated. "You stayed," she said. "I stayed." She considered this. "Scout let you." He glanced at the dog. Scout was sitting 3 feet away, facing the sunrise, posture indicating that no particular threat had materialized during the night. "I noticed that," Ronan said. He made coffee from the camp kit in his saddlebag, and he sat on the porch step and drank it while the sun cleared the horizon and the temperature crawled up from 41 to 48. He asked Wren if she wanted to tell him about Grandpa George. She didn't answer immediately. She had a way of holding questions, letting them sit between them while she decided whether the answer was something she could afford to give. Eventually she said, "He smelled like motor oil and that stuff in the little round tin." "Lip balm?" "The stuff for hands." "Salve." "He smelled like that." "And coffee." She paused. "He used to read to me at night. Through the bars. He'd sit right there." She pointed at the porch step where Ronan was sitting. "He'd read until I fell asleep, even when it was cold. He had a really big coat." Ronan looked at the step beneath him. He didn't say anything. After a while, she said, in a voice that was trying to be matter-of-fact and wasn't quite making it, "Is he coming back?" And Ronan, who had spent 12 years delivering information about irreversible events to people who needed to hear it, looked at this small girl through rusted bars and said, as gently as he knew how, "No, Wren, he's not coming back." The girl nodded. She'd known. She'd known for 6 weeks. But there's a difference between what a person knows and what a person can hold. And for one moment, something very young and very unguarded moved across her face before she pulled it back behind those careful gray eyes. She turned away from him and pressed her back against the bars and looked at the horizon. Scout moved to her side. Ronan drank his coffee and didn't look away and didn't try to fill the silence with anything, because some silences are doing work, and interrupting them is a kind of violence. Patricia Cross arrived at noon with a woman named Dr. Adayeze Obi, a child development specialist who did consultation work for the county, but operated with enough independence to assess situations before they became case files. Dr. Obi was small and direct and wore a down vest over a flannel shirt, and looked at the enclosure for a long time without speaking before she crouched down to Wren's eye level and introduced herself simply, with her name and no further explanation of who she was or why she was there. Wren looked at her. "Scout won't let most people this close," Wren said. I noticed he let me walk up, Dr. Obi said. I take that as a compliment. Something very small shifted in Ren's expression. Not quite a smile. A recognition. Ronan stood back and watched the two of them talk. He'd been around enough assessments to know what he was seeing, a professional peeling back layers slowly, following the child's pace rather than imposing a structure. Dr. Obi asked about the dogs' names. She asked about the books. There was a stack of board books inside the enclosure, 10 or 12 of them, worn to softness, pages crimped with use. She asked about which one was Ren's favorite. Ren considered. The one about the bear who loses his button. Corduroy. Grandpa George read it wrong on purpose, and I had to correct him every time. Did he really not know the right version, or was he doing it on purpose? Another consideration. Both, Ren decided. Patricia and Ronan stood together near the farmhouse wall. The older woman kept her voice low. Adayez will write her assessment, Patricia said. That goes to the county supervisor, not the frontline workers. That matters. It means someone reads what actually happened here before anyone decides what it means. And then what? Then the question is placement. There's an aunt, distant, May Holloway. She's in Cascade County, about 2 hours west. George had her listed as an emergency contact in some documents he filed with a local clinic years ago. She paused. Nobody has contacted her yet. Why not? Because nobody knew to look for her until I found the clinic record this morning. Ronan looked at the enclosure. Ren was showing Dr. Obi how Briggs responded to specific words, demonstrating, with the precise instructional authority of a 6-year-old who is expert at something, that Briggs knew at least 7 commands and would follow them even from inside the bars. The dogs, Ronan said. Patricia sighed. It was a specific sigh, the kind that precedes information the signer already knows won't be well received. Standard placement protocols don't accommodate animals this large. If Ren goes into emergency foster care, she won't go without them. Ronan, I'm telling you right now, she won't go without them. And if you try to separate them, you'll understand why in about 30 seconds of watching how she functions. He kept his voice even. He wasn't angry. He was descriptive. Those dogs are not pets. They're structural. She's built her entire operational reality around them. You take them away, you're not just removing dogs, you're removing the only architecture she's got left. Patricia looked at him. I hear you, she said. You need to make sure the right people hear it. She pulled out a notepad and wrote something down. I'll make some calls. She clicked the pen. You're planning on staying? For now. She studied him in the sideways, thorough manner of someone who has spent decades reading people and knows not to trust first reads. Why? She asked. Not accusatory. Genuinely curious. He looked at the enclosure, at the small girl with the careful gray eyes who was currently explaining, with great seriousness, the difference between the sounds Briggs made when she was happy versus when she was concerned. Someone needs to be here, he said. There are professionals for that. She's not scared of me, he said. She's still scared of almost everything else. But she's not scared of me. He paused. That's something. That's worth protecting. Patricia Cross said nothing for a moment. Then she said, 24 hours ago, you didn't know this child existed. I know. And now you're sleeping on a porch in 40-degree weather. I've slept in worse. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she made another note on her pad and said, I'll tell Adayez you're a known associate of my organization. That gives you some standing if anyone questions your presence. He nodded. She went to speak with Dr. Obi. Ronan walked back to the enclosure and sat down on the ground against the outside of the bars, his back to them, facing the field. After a moment, he felt a small pressure against his shoulder blade. Ren, leaning against the bars from the inside, not asking for anything, just placing herself there. Scout settled in beside Ronan's left knee. Briggs shifted inside the enclosure and rested her chin on Ren's foot. The wind came across the field from the northwest, and the clouds moved and the light changed, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk described a long, patient circle above the dead grass. That evening, after Patricia and Dr. Obi had left, Ronan called his chapter president. The man who answered was named Doyle Marsh, 52, former Marine, ran the chapter with a combination of operational precision and the particular emotional intelligence of someone who had learned the hard way that men who refused to acknowledge what they were feeling were significantly more dangerous than men who didn't. Doyle listened to everything Ronan said. He didn't interrupt. When Ronan finished, there was a silence of exactly the length it took Doyle to decide how seriously to take what he'd just heard. "You missed the gathering," Doyle said, "and this is why." "This is why." Another silence. "You need anything?" "Not yet. But you might." "But I might." "Then call." That was the whole conversation. Ronan could picture Doyle putting the phone down and turning back to whatever he'd been doing before, and he could picture him also saying something to the men nearby. Not explaining, not editorializing, just the chapter president indicating that one of their own was in the middle of something and that something mattered. He knew how the iron vow worked. That phone call was already a message. He made dinner on the camp stove. Canned soup, crackers, more of the apples he'd bought. He passed Wren's portions through the bars. They ate in silence, the comfortable kind, and while the light failed and the temperature dropped, he found one of the composition notebooks inside the farmhouse. Blank, Grandpa George had kept a supply, and brought it out with a pen and sat on the step. "What are you doing?" Wren asked. "Writing down some things I need to remember." "What things?" He considered. "Things about the dogs, so I know what to tell the people who need to know about them." She watched him. "What do you need to know?" "Everything you think is important." So she told him. She talked for an hour and 15 minutes, through the failing light and into the lantern's glow, with the precision and the passion of a person describing the most important subject they know. Scout's fear response to the sound of truck backfires and how you had to get very low and quiet and let him smell your hands. Briggs's preference for sleeping with her chin elevated. The specific command that would tell both of them to stay, not stay, but a hand signal, 2 fingers extended horizontally, which George had developed because he'd worried about giving commands in the dark. The way Scout could sense when Wren's breathing was wrong before Wren knew herself, and would push his head against her hand until she focused on him. Ronan wrote all of it down. Every word. When she finally ran out of things to say, she looked at the notebook and said quietly, "You're going to tell them they can't be separated." "Yes." "Do you think they'll listen?" He looked at her across the lantern light. Bare feet, careful eyes. A child who had spent 6 weeks alone except for 2 dogs, and had organized herself around that reality with a completeness that was the most heartbreaking thing he'd ever seen. "I'm going to make them listen," he said. She held his gaze. "Scout trusts you," she said finally. "I know." "He doesn't trust almost anyone." "I know." She looked at the dog and then back at Ronan, and something moved through those careful gray eyes. Something at the edge of trust, not there yet, but leaning toward it the way a door leans into a strong wind. "Okay," she said. Just that. Just okay. But coming from Wren Holloway, Ronan was already learning, okay was the thing you worked for. Okay was everything. He stayed on the porch again that night. In the small hours, lying in the bedroll with the stars brutally clear above and the temperature somewhere below freezing now, he heard Wren's breathing slow into sleep, heard Scout shift position, heard the deep, repaired but not gone sound of Briggs's breath. He lay there and stared at the sky, and he thought, nobody knows I'm here. Nobody in the world except Patricia and Doyle and a child psychologist named Adieze Obi. No one would miss him for another few days. He disappeared into this windswept corner of Montana and somehow, without a plan, without any of the equipment a person typically deploys for a situation like this, he'd become the thing between this child and whatever came next. He didn't have a strategy. He'd told Doyle he might need something but didn't know what yet. That was the honest truth of it. He was a medic without a diagnosis, standing in a wound he couldn't close with pressure and time. But in the morning, something would change. In the morning, a White County vehicle would pull down the gravel track toward the ranch, and inside it would be a caseworker named Raymond Gill, who had 32 open cases and a department mandate that prioritized documented compliance over practical outcomes. And Raymond Gill would look at the enclosure and see exactly one thing, a child in a cage. And he would pull out his phone and make a call, and the call would set something in motion that Ronan would spend the next 3 weeks of his life trying to redirect. And he would need every man in his chapter and every ally Patricia Cross had ever built, and every ounce of the stubborn, patient endurance that had kept him functional through a decade and a half of impossible situations. But he didn't know that yet. Right now there was just the cold and the stars, and a little girl asleep inside a cage because the world outside it hadn't given her a reason to trust it. Not yet. Raymond Gill arrived at 8:47 in the morning. Ronan heard the vehicle before he saw it. Tires on gravel, the particular sound of a car moving at the careful speed of someone who isn't sure what they're driving toward. He was already on his feet, coffee in hand, standing at the edge of the porch when the white county sedan came around the bend in the track and stopped 30 yards from the farmhouse. The engine idled for a moment. Then it cut off. The man who stepped out was somewhere in his mid-40s, heavy-set in the soft way of someone who'd once been athletic and had allowed that to recede without much resistance. He wore a county ID badge on a lanyard over a fleece vest. He carried a tablet computer in one hand and a travel mug in the other. He looked at the farmhouse. He looked at Ronan. He looked at Scout, who had positioned himself between the porch and the car with the calm, immovable authority of a border collie who had decided exactly where the boundary was. Raymond Gill looked at Scout for a long moment. Then he looked at Ronan. "Sir, I'm Raymond Gill, Department of Family Services, Custer County. I received a report regarding a child at this address." He read the address from his tablet. "Is that this property?" "It is," Ronan said. "And you are?" "Ronan Voss. I've been on site since the day before yesterday. I'm a former combat medic, and I'm a known associate of the Family Advocacy Network out of Billings. Patricia Cross can confirm that." Joel made a note. "Is the child present?" "She is." "Can you take me to her?" Ronan drank the last of his coffee, set the cup down on the porch rail with a sound that was very quiet and very deliberate. "I can," he said, "but I want to tell you some things first." Jill's expression didn't change. He had the face of a man who had learned to make his face do very little, which was a skill that cut both ways. It protected him from manipulation and prevented him from receiving information that arrived emotionally rather than procedurally. "Sir, if there's a child in an unsafe situation, she's not in an unsafe situation," Ronan said. "She's in a complex one. Those are different things, and the difference matters for what happens next. I'd appreciate 2 minutes." Jill studied him. People didn't typically ask caseworkers for 2 minutes before walking them to a child. The irregularity seemed to produce something in him. Not suspicion exactly, but a recalibration. 2 minutes, he said. Ronan told him about the journal, about George Holloway's logic, flawed as it was, and the distinction between design and consequence. He told him about the dogs and Wren's functional relationship to them, not as a point of negotiation, but as a clinical fact, framed in the same flat, precise language he'd used in field assessments for years. He told him about Dr. Adea's OB's visit the previous afternoon and that a professional assessment was already in progress. He kept his voice level. He maintained eye contact. He did not tell Jill how to do his job. Jill listened. He made notes. Then he said, "I'll need to see the child." They walked around the side of the farmhouse together. Scout followed at Ronan's left knee, which Jill noticed and seemed to file away but didn't comment on. When they came around the corner and the enclosure was visible, Jill stopped walking. He looked at it for a long time. Ronan watched his face, watched the institutional response move across it, the assessment, the categorization, the documentation reflex. Watched the man's eyes find Wren inside the enclosure and then move immediately to the bars, the lock, the dimensions, the cage. That was the word assembling itself behind Jill's careful expression, and it was the right word and also exactly the wrong frame. Wren looked at the stranger. She pulled her knees closer to her chest. Scout moved in front of Ronan, between all of them and the enclosure, and sat down. Not a threat, a statement. "Hello," Jill said, his voice shifting into a register that Ronan recognized as trained child interaction protocol. Softer, slower, the deliberate reduction of official cadence. "My name is Raymond. What's yours?" Wren looked at him, said nothing. Jill glanced at Ronan. "She talks," Ronan said. "Give her a minute." The minute passed. Wren looked at Scout. Scout's posture communicated something that only she and Briggs fully decoded, but it seemed to be enough because she said very quietly, "Wren." "Hi, Wren. I'm here to make sure you're okay." She looked at him with those flat, measuring gray eyes. "I'm okay," she said. "Can you tell me how long you've been in there?" A pause. She looked at the sky. "Since before the cold came back." Jill made a note. He asked several more questions about food, about water, about her physical condition, about whether she was in pain anywhere. Wren answered each one with the economy of a child who had learned to separate useful information from information that had costs attached to it. She was not hostile, she was not afraid exactly. She was assessing him the way she assessed every new thing, with patient thoroughness and no commitment. When Jill asked about leaving the enclosure, she said, "I have a key." "You have a key to the lock?" "Yes." "But you haven't used it." "No." "Why not?" Wren looked at Briggs, who was lying beside her with her bandaged leg extended. Then she looked at Ronan. Then she looked back at Jill with an expression that said very clearly that she found this question so obvious it barely deserved processing. "Because this is where they are," she said. Jill wrote something on his tablet. Ronan didn't like the way he wrote it. None. The county vehicle left at 11:15. Jill had been professional, thorough. He'd photographed the enclosure, the surrounding property, the farmhouse exterior. He'd taken down every answer Wren had given him. He'd confirmed Ronan's contact information and Patricia Cross's, and he'd said, with the particular neutral precision of someone making a statement for the record rather than a human promise, that he would be in contact with Patricia's office and with Dr. Obi's assessor, and that he'd be filing his preliminary report by end of day. He had not said what the report would recommend. He hadn't needed to. Ronan sat on the porch step after the car disappeared around the bend in the track and did not move for several minutes. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of cold that carried distance. You could see the mountains to the northwest as a hard, dark line, close-looking, the way mountains looked in Montana when the air was clear enough to strip away all the atmosphere's usual softening. The land between him and those mountains was enormous and entirely indifferent. "He's going to take me away," Wren said. It wasn't a question. Ronan didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about what was true versus what was useful to say, and trying to find the place where those two things overlapped. "He's going to make some recommendations," he said finally. "That's not the same as a decision. It's how decisions start." He looked at her. She looked back at him with those 6-year-old eyes that had seen 6 years of something most people didn't accumulate in 60. And he thought again about what George Holloway had written, someone with enough broken in them to understand what they're looking at. "Yes," he said, "it's how decisions start. And the dogs. I'm working on that. You keep saying that, because I keep working on it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you going to be there? Wherever they send me?" He held her gaze. "I don't know where that is yet. But if you knew..." He exhaled. Cold air visible for a second, dispersing. "I'd figure out how to be close to it," he said. She looked at him for a long time with an expression he was learning to read. Not as trust, not yet, but as the consideration of trust. The active assessment of whether a person was the kind of thing you could afford to lean on, or whether they were the kind that looked solid until you put weight on them and then weren't. "Okay," she said. "Just okay." Ronan stood up and went to call Patricia Cross. The first Iron Vow bike arrived that afternoon. Ronan heard it from half a mile out, the particular register of a Harley Softail, a sound he could identify by pitch the way some people identified voices. He was in the farmhouse, working his way through what was left of George Holloway's papers, looking for any documentation relevant to Wren's legal situation when the engine sound reached him. He set the papers down and went to the porch. The man who rode in was named Cole Draper. 41. Built like someone had assembled him from spare parts left over from larger men, wide shoulders tapering to narrow hips, arms that looked disproportionately long until you saw how he used them. He had a face that had been interesting before something had rearranged it, a nose that had been broken at least twice, a scar along his left jaw from a piece of steel that had come off a lathe in a machine shop 12 years ago. He'd been with the chapter for 8 years. Before that, 2 tours in Afghanistan with a route clearance unit, which meant he'd spent 24 months driving very slowly down very dangerous roads, looking for buried things that wanted to kill him, and he'd brought some of that hypervigilance home with him as invisible luggage that he was still trying to unpack. He parked beside Ronan's Road King, cut the engine, and sat for a moment just looking at the property. Then he swung off the bike, pulled a canvas bag from the saddlebag, and walked to the porch without hurrying. "Doyle send you?" Ronan asked. "Nobody sends me anywhere," Cole said. It was technically true and completely inaccurate. He set the canvas bag on the porch step. "Brought some things." The bag contained a proper sleeping bag rated to 15 below, 2 pairs of wool socks, a waterproof ground pad, 3 cans of real soup, not the gas station kind, a jar of peanut butter, a bag of dog food that was substantially better than anything Ronan had found at the gas station, and a children's picture book with a dog on the cover. Ronan looked at the book. Emma's kid had duplicates, Cole said, not meeting his eyes. Emma was a woman Cole had been involved with briefly 2 years ago, the involvement ending amicably because Cole was bad at sustained proximity and knew it. Figured a kid might like it. "You drove 4 hours with a picture book in your saddlebag." "I drove 4 hours with several things in my saddlebag, including a picture book." Cole pulled a cigarette from his vest pocket and lit it, turning slightly into the wind to protect the flame. He looked at the enclosure around the corner of the farmhouse. He hadn't been told about the enclosure specifically, just told there was a child in a difficult situation and Ronan needed eyes nearby. He processed what he was seeing without commenting on it. After a moment, he asked, "How long?" 6 weeks. Cole drew on the cigarette, exhaled. "The dogs?" "Her whole world." Cole looked at Scout, who was sitting near the enclosure bars watching Cole with the same thorough, non-hostile assessment it gave everyone new. Cole crouched down, extended a hand, let Scout come to him rather than moving forward. Scout approached, sniffed, held still. Cole laid his palm along the dog's jaw briefly. "Military trained," Cole said. "Somebody trained this dog." "Grandfather, I think. He was practical." Cole stood. "What do you need?" "Right now, just someone who knows where I am." "And in 3 days, when the county makes a decision you don't like?" Ronan was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the field. "Then I'll need several someones." Cole nodded. He finished the cigarette down to the filter with the focused efficiency of a man who didn't waste things. He field-stripped it and pocketed the filter. "I'll be in Dunn Creek. There's a motel off the main road. Call me." He turned to go back to his bike, then stopped. "Ronan." "Yeah." "Doyle wants to talk to you." "I know." "Not by phone." Ronan looked at him. "Tell him I'll come in when I can." "He'd rather come to you." Ronan understood what that meant. Doyle coming to you rather than summoning you to Billings was the chapter president making a statement about priority. It meant the situation had been discussed in Ronan's absence and a position had been taken. Whether that position was supportive or corrective, he wouldn't know until Doyle was standing in front of him. "Tell him Thursday," Ronan said. "If the county moves before then, I'll call." Cole got on his bike and rode out. Thursday came with ice on the gravel in Doyle Marsh's truck at 8 in the morning. He drove a truck rather than riding in cold below 40, which was a practical calculation he'd made at 50 and held to without apology. He was a large man, larger than Ronan, with the kind of stillness that accumulated in men who had been in charge of other men's lives long enough to know that most problems required patience before they required action. He had gray in his beard and a Marine Corps tattoo on his left forearm that he never discussed, and a way of listening that made you feel heard before he said a single word. He pulled up, got out, looked at the property. He looked at the enclosure. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Show me." Ronan walked him through everything: the journal, the dogs, the timeline, Dr. Obi's assessment, the county visit. Doyle asked 3 questions during the entire briefing, each of them targeted precisely at the gaps in what Ronan had told him. He'd been a platoon commander. He still listened that way. When Ronan finished, Doyle walked to the enclosure. Wren watched him approach with her standard assessment expression. Doyle crouched down to her level without Ronan having to tell him to. He looked at her for a moment, and something moved through his face. Not sentimentality, nothing that soft, but a recognition. The look of a man who has seen people abandoned by the systems that were supposed to hold them and has learned to identify what that looks like on a face. "You're Wren," he said. "Yes." "I'm Doyle. I know Ronan." "He stayed on the porch," Wren said. "I heard that." A pause. "Cold nights for it." "I told him he didn't have to." "He's stubborn." Wren considered this. "He's consistent," she corrected. Something in Doyle's face moved again. He glanced back at Ronan over his shoulder. Then he looked at Scout, who had allowed him within 3 feet without moving, which Doyle filed away. He stood. He and Ronan moved back toward the farmhouse. "What's the county going to do?" Doyle asked. "Patricia thinks emergency placement within a week. There's an aunt in Cascade County, May Holloway, George's niece by marriage. She's been contacted. She's willing." "The dogs?" "That's the problem." Doyle put his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked at the field. "What does Patricia say?" "She says the aunt's property would need to pass an animal accommodation assessment before the placement could include the dogs, which it won't currently. It's a rental, small yard, no fencing beyond a decorative hedge. So they'd separate them. That's what the regulations require." Doyle was quiet for a moment. The ice on the gravel had begun to melt where the sun hit it, and there was a sound of water moving somewhere under the frozen grass. "What does the girl do without the dogs?" "Retreats," Ronan said. "Shuts down. I've watched it happen when Briggs was at the edge of the enclosure and couldn't immediately respond to her. Wren's breathing changes. Her eyes go somewhere else. She comes back when the dog touches her." "That's not behavioral preference," Doyle said. "No, it's regulation." Doyle looked at him. "Meaning she needs them the way some people need medication. It regulates something. Dr. Obi used the word anchoring. The dogs anchor her to the present. Without them—" Ronan stopped, restarted. "She'll survive without them. She's already proven she can survive almost anything, but it'll cost her something she can't afford to spend." The wind moved between them. "What do you need?" Doyle asked. "Time, money, labor. Someone who knows construction. Someone who knows family law. And Patricia needs people to write letters. Not form letters, real ones, testimonies. People who've seen Wren with the dogs and can describe what they've seen in terms a review board will take seriously." Doyle looked at the enclosure again. At Wren, who had taken out the picture book Cole had brought and was showing something in it to Briggs with the focused explanatory attention of a teacher who believed in the intelligence of her audience. "I'll make calls," Doyle said. "Doyle." "Yeah." "There's something else." Ronan pulled the composition notebook from his vest pocket. Not George's journal, but the one he'd filled with Wren's information about the dogs. 3 pages of dense notes. "I need someone to talk to a family law specialist, not about the aunt, about me." Doyle looked at him without expression. "I'm not saying I'm the right option," Ronan said, and he meant it, the uncertainty in his voice not performed but actual. "I'm saying I want to know what the options even are, what the process looks like, what would have to be true for someone like me." He gestured at himself, at the vest, at the accumulated evidence of what his life looked like from the outside. "To be considered." A long silence. "You've known this child for 8 days, Doyle said. "I know." 8 days, Ronan." "I know what 8 days is." He held Doyle's gaze. "I also know what it feels like when something's your responsibility. When you've been assigned to something and walking away is an option that technically exists but doesn't actually exist. You know what that feels like." Doyle was quiet for a long time. "I do," he said. "So don't tell me 8 days like it's a disqualifier. It's a fact. I'm not confused about it." Another silence. The wind. The ice melting. Somewhere behind the farmhouse, Wren was reading to the dog. "I'll make calls," Doyle said again. And this time, there were more calls in it. The chapter arrived over the following 4 days in the way the Iron Vow always arrived. Without announcement, without ceremony, without anyone asking for credit. Cole was already in Dunn Creek. He came back the day after Doyle's visit with two men from the chapter's extended network, a retired contractor named Whit Sturgis who'd spent 30 years building things in the northern Rockies and assessed structural problems the way doctors assessed patients, with experience rather than instruments, and a quiet, large man everyone called Decker, who had been doing finish carpentry since he was 16 and could look at a building's condition and give you a materials list from memory. They spent half a day at May Holloway's property in Cascade County without her asking them to, Doyle having spoken to May directly and May having agreed with the wariness of a woman who was trying to do right by a great niece she'd met twice and didn't know how. The property was a rental on a double lot with a landlord who proved, when approached by Doyle in person, to be more flexible on modifications than his lease language suggested, particularly after Doyle explained what the modifications were for and offered to fund them entirely. Whit said the fencing would take 3 weekends. Decker said 2. They split the difference and started that Saturday. Ronan was not in Cascade County. Ronan was at the ranch because someone needed to be at the ranch, and because Wren's comfort had become indexed, at least partially, to his presence in a way that he was careful not to interpret as dependence. She was not dependent on him, she was dependent on consistency, and he happened to be the consistent thing currently available. He understood the distinction and held it carefully, the way you hold something you might break. The days had developed a rhythm. Morning, coffee, food passed through the bars, Wren's careful recitation of whatever she'd been thinking about during the night, which ranged from the structural properties of the enclosure bars — she'd tested their resistance once and described the results with engineering precision — to a question about whether dogs dreamed and, if so, what they dreamed about. Afternoon. Ronan would read to her, working through George Holloway's small library of children's books that he found in a plastic bin inside the farmhouse, one chapter at a time, sitting with his back against the enclosure bars while she sat on the inside. Evening. He'd cook, they'd eat, she'd sleep earlier than seemed natural for a child until he understood that sleep was how she traveled, away from the days, into somewhere the enclosure wasn't. He'd started leaving the composition notebook open on the porch step, writing things in it after she fell asleep. Not notes about the dogs anymore. Things she said. Small observations. The way she described the sound of the wind as the field breathing. The way she held her spoon when she ate, right hand, very upright, like someone who'd been taught careful table manners in unusual circumstances. The way she laughed. She'd laughed twice in the days he'd been there. Once at something he'd read wrong in a book, and once at Briggs's attempt to catch a moth, and both times it was a startled sound, like she'd surprised herself, like laughter was something that happened to her rather than something she produced. He was keeping a record. He hadn't examined why. The chapter meeting that Ronan missed happened on a Tuesday night in the back room of the Iron Vows shop in Billings. He wasn't there, but Cole called him afterward, standing in the parking lot with the background noise of the chapter dispersing. Engines starting, brief exchanges, the particular sound of men who'd been sitting with something heavy for 2 hours and were releasing it into the night air. "There's a vote," Cole said. "About what?" "About resources. Official chapter resources. The fencing, the legal fees. There's a question of whether this falls inside chapter scope." Ronan was quiet. "Who's opposing it?" A pause. "Garrett." Ronan exhaled. Marcus Garrett was 47 and had been with the chapter for 11 years and had the particular kind of loyalty that attached to principles rather than people, which meant he was simultaneously the most reliable man Ronan knew in a legal crisis and the hardest man to move once he'd decided something was outside his territory. What's his argument? That the chapter isn't a social services agency. That committing resources to an individual situation, one that isn't connected to our work, one that involves a man making a personal decision nobody voted on, sets a precedent he doesn't want to set. "He's not wrong," Ronan said. "I know he's not wrong," Cole said. "That's what makes it a problem." The call lasted another 10 minutes. The vote had been 7-3 in favor of committing chapter resources, with 2 abstentions. Doyle had voted yes, Garrett had voted no. The other 2 no votes were men Ronan knew only peripherally. newer members who tended to follow Garrett's lead on matters of organizational policy. 7-3 was enough. But 3 was not nothing. 3 meant something that would need to be addressed. "Tell Garrett I'll talk to him," Ronan said. "He knows you will. He's waiting for it." "Tell him it'll be face-to-face. He knows that too." After Cole hung up, Ronan sat on the porch step in the dark. The temperature had dropped below 20. The stars were the same brutally clear assembly as the night before and the night before that, and he sat among them thinking about 7 and 3 and the weight of both numbers. He hadn't asked the chapter to do this. Doyle had made that decision, which meant Doyle had decided this was worth the internal friction it would cost. He'd made that calculation quietly and without consultation, and Ronan owed him for it, which was a debt he understood how to carry, even if he couldn't immediately see how to repay it. He went inside and slept on the farmhouse floor for the first time. The porch had become genuinely dangerous in the cold, and Wren had told him, with the firm practicality of someone who'd calculated the risks, that she could hear him from inside the house just as well as from the porch. He'd confirmed this by testing the distance. She was right. She was frequently right about spatial and acoustic details, having spent weeks calibrating her environment with the precise attention of someone for whom the environment was the entire available world. He lay on the floor in the sleeping bag Cole had brought and listened to the wind against the farmhouse walls and thought about Garrett, about the 3 no votes, about the precedent argument, which was real and which he couldn't dismiss just because it was inconvenient. He'd made a unilateral decision in a moment of encounter. He'd stopped on a highway because of dogs. He'd spent 8 days at an abandoned ranch because of a child's voice. He'd pulled his chapter into the gravity of a situation he hadn't consulted anyone about, hadn't voted on, hadn't brought through any process. He'd simply decided the way men like him decided things, from the gut, from the wound, from the particular frequency of recognition that fired when you saw something that looked like your own damage wearing a different face. He was not confused about the costs of that. He just couldn't make himself regret the decision. The county's official determination arrived on a Friday. Patricia Cross called him at 9 a.m., which was earlier than she typically called, and the earliness told him everything before she said a word. "The preliminary determination is emergency placement within 72 hours, she said. "May Holloway's residence has been approved pending a home visit scheduled for Monday. The placement will include Wren and her essential belongings." "And the dogs," Ronan said. "Not a question. The dogs are classified as non-essential personal property under the emergency placement protocol. The regulation doesn't allow for animal transfer in emergency situations without a completed Patricia. Animal welfare and accommodation assessment, which can take up to 3 weeks. Patricia. To complete, and given the emergency timeline. Say it plainly, he said. A pause. The dogs cannot go with her, Patricia said, not within the 72-hour window. If the accommodation at May's property is brought up to standard and the assessment is completed, there's a pathway for transfer. But not Monday. Ronan stood very still. He was in the farmhouse, standing near the window that faced the enclosure. Through the dirty glass, he could see Wren sitting cross-legged with Scout pressed against her left side and Briggs's head across her knee. She was doing what she did every morning, processing the night, calibrating the day, moving from whatever interior place she'd traveled to in sleep back toward the present moment with Scout as her compass bearing. She'll go back inside, he said. If you take the dogs, she'll go back in. I know. She'll retreat completely, back to where she was before. He stopped. He was not a man who lost his composure on phone calls. He had not lost his composure in a phone call in 11 years. He was not losing it now exactly, but something was pressing against the walls of his chest in a way that required management. You understand what I'm telling you. I do, Patricia said. And I've submitted Dr. Obi's assessment to the supervisor with a formal request for an exemption. But the exemption has to go through a regional review board, and that process, how long? 2 to 3 weeks minimum. 72 hours versus 2 to 3 weeks. The space between those numbers was where Wren Holloway would spend 2 to 3 weeks without the only things that kept her anchored to the world outside her own head. There has to be an emergency exception process, Ronan said. There is. It requires documentation of clinical necessity. Dr. Obi's assessment qualifies, but the regional director has to sign off, and the regional director is another pause. The regional director has reviewed the documentation, and he's indicated he's not willing to make an exception on the basis of animal attachment. Did he read the assessment? He read it. And he read it, and he made a determination. His language was, Patricia's voice took on a careful quality, the voice of someone selecting words. His language was that while he understood the child's attachment to the animals, he did not believe that attachment rose to the level of clinical necessity that would justify deviation from standard protocol. Ronan was quiet. "He's wrong," he said. "I believe he is. But he's also the one with the authority." Ronan turned away from the window. He sat down on the floor where he'd slept, back against the wall, knees up, looking at the ceiling. The farmhouse ceiling had water damage in 2 corners and a crack running across it that suggested foundation settlement, the kind of crack that was old enough to be stable but dramatic enough to make new visitors uncomfortable. "What happens to the dogs?" he asked. "County Animal Services. They'd be assessed for adoption." "Together?" A pause that lasted 1 second too long. "I can't guarantee they'd be placed together," Patricia said. The ceiling crack. The cold in the room. The sound of Wren's voice from outside, talking to the dogs in the low, even murmur she used when she was reading to them from memory. Stories she'd reconstructed from what George had read her, imperfect and pieced together and absolutely precise in the emotional truth. "I need you to buy me time," Ronan said. "How much time?" "As much as you can get." He stood up. "I'm calling Doyle." He hung up and called Doyle and told him everything in under 3 minutes. Doyle was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then he said, "Witt and Decker can have the May Holloway property fenced in 72 hours if they work through the night. The assessment still takes 2 weeks." "I have a name," Doyle said. "A lawyer in Great Falls who does family law and animal law and has appeared in front of the Regional Review Board before. Her name is Carla Ibsen. She's expensive and she's fast and she knows the exemption process better than the regional director does. Get her on the phone." "She's already on the phone. I called her an hour ago." Ronan stopped moving. "An hour ago, before I called you." "I've been expecting this call since Wednesday," Doyle said. The weight of that settled over Ronan like weather. He thought about 7 and 3, about the men who had voted no, about Garrett waiting for a face-to-face conversation, about a chapter president who had calculated all of this before Ronan had finished calculating it, and had already begun moving pieces on a board that Ronan hadn't realized they were both playing on. "What do you need from me?" Ronan asked. "Get to May Holloway's property," Doyle said. "Today. I need you there when Witt and Decker show up. The landlord needs someone with authority to make decisions in the moment. What goes where, what the dogs need specifically. You're the only one who knows that." "I can't leave Wren. Cole's going there now." "She doesn't know Cole." "She's met him once. She let Scout approach him." Doyle's voice was steady, factual. "You told me Scout doesn't trust easily." Ronan closed his eyes for a moment. He walked to the farmhouse door and opened it and stood in the cold morning air. Wren looked up from the enclosure. Scout looked up. Even Briggs raised her head. "Someone's coming to stay with you today," he told Wren. "His name is Cole. You've seen him before." Wren looked at him. "Where are you going?" she asked. "I'm going to build something," he said, "for you and the dogs." She looked at him for a long time, measuring. Then she said, with a certainty that was 3 parts trust and 1 part something she'd decided he'd earned, "Will it work?" And Ronan Voss, who had spent his adult life trying to give people honest answers about hard things, looked at this 6-year-old child who had organized her entire existence around loyalty and waited 6 weeks for someone to notice her and said, "I'm going to make it work." He got on his bike. The engine turned over. Cold air hit his face like a closed fist. He pulled out onto Route 9 North and opened the throttle, and the Harley responded the way it always did, the familiar shudder through his hands and knees, the world compressing into the lane ahead. He had 108 miles to cover. He had lumber yards to call, and a lawyer in Great Falls to brief, and a regional director's determination to dismantle with whatever tools the law provided. He had 72 hours. He had almost exactly enough rage. He had just reached the highway, the bike hitting its stride at 70 miles per hour, the cold burning his cheeks above the neck gaiter when his phone lit up in his pocket. He let it go. He couldn't answer its speed on this road. 3 miles later, he pulled over. The missed call was from Patricia Cross. The voicemail was 11 seconds. He played it once, and then he sat on the shoulder of Route 9 North in the cold October air while traffic moved past him in sparse, indifferent intervals, and he listened to the 11 seconds again to make sure he'd heard it correctly. He had. Patricia's voice. Ronan, the regional director has moved up the timeline. Ren is being collected tomorrow morning. Not Monday. Tomorrow. I don't know why the change. I'm trying to find out. Call me. Tomorrow morning. 48 hours removed from 72 hours. The fencing couldn't be done. The lawyer couldn't move the board in time. The accommodation assessment would take 2 weeks regardless of anything Carla Ibsen argued. The dogs would go to County Animal Services. They would be separated from Ren. They might be separated from each other. And Ren Holloway, who had built her entire surviving self around 2 animals, and the consistency of the space they occupied together, would be placed in a house in Cascade County without them, and something in her would go back into the cage that didn't have iron bars, the one she'd been inside since long before George Holloway had built the other kind. Ronan sat on the shoulder of the highway. The wind came off the plains with nothing in it to stop it. He thought about 7 and 3. He thought about Garrett and the precedent argument. He thought about what it meant to make a decision nobody voted on, from the gut, from the wound, from the frequency of recognition. Then he called Doyle. I need everyone, he said. A pause. Everyone, Doyle repeated. Every man who voted yes. Every associate. Patricia's network. May Holloway's landlord. Dr. Obie, Cole, Witt, Decker. Everyone. Tonight. Another pause. Longer. The sound of Doyle thinking, which was a sound that produced decisions rather than doubts. What are you going to do? Doyle asked. Ronan turned the bike around on Route 9 North and pointed it back toward the ranch, back toward Wren, back toward Scout and Briggs and the rusted bars of an enclosure that a dying grandfather had built as a gesture of love, so flawed it looked like cruelty to everyone who hadn't read the notebook with the large, unsteady handwriting. I'm going to be there when they come, Ronan said, and I'm going to have something for them to look at that changes what they see. That's not a plan, Doyle said. It will be, Ronan said. By tonight, it will be. He hit the throttle. The Harley screamed toward the horizon. And somewhere behind him, in every direction, men who had spent their lives being the thing that came too late were deciding whether this time they could come in time. He made it back to the ranch in 51 minutes. The ride should have taken 65. He didn't think about the difference. He pulled off Route 9 North onto the gravel track and killed the headlight before he reached the bend. Habit rather than intention. The way soldiers moved in unfamiliar darkness without deciding to. The cold had deepened in the 2 hours he'd been gone. Somewhere in the low 20s now, the kind of cold that got into metal and made it contract, made hinges stiffen and latches resist. His hands were functional but slow when he pulled off his gloves in front of the farmhouse. Cole was on the porch. He was standing, not sitting, which told Ronan something before anything was said. Standing with a coffee cup he wasn't drinking from, and his eyes on the enclosure, the particular posture of a man maintaining a watch post he hadn't been told to abandon. She know anything? Ronan asked. No. Cole's voice was low. She asked where you went. I told her what you said, that you were building something. She accepted that. How is she? Reading to the dogs. She's been doing it for an hour. A pause. She does it like someone who knows the stories by heart but keeps checking the book anyway. Like she needs the physical object. Ronan looked at the enclosure. The lantern was on inside. A warm orange glow that made the rusted bars cast long shadows across the dead grass. In that light, with Scout pressed against one side and Briggs across her legs, Ren Holloway looked like something from a photograph taken in a place time had stopped visiting. I need to make calls, Ronan said. I need quiet, and I need an hour. Go, Cole said. He turned back to the porch rail. I've got her. Ronan went inside. He called Patricia first. Patricia had found out why the timeline had moved. A scheduling conflict in the regional director's office had compressed the Monday visit into Saturday, a bureaucratic convenience that had no malice in it and produced the same outcome as malice would have. She had filed an emergency appeal with the district family court, requesting a 72-hour stay of placement pending the animal accommodation review. The appeal was assigned to a duty judge named Harold Crane, who was 61 and had 12 years on the family court bench and was, in Patricia's assessment, a man who read documentation carefully and made decisions on its merits. The appeal would be heard at 8 the following morning. Wren was scheduled for pickup at 9. 1 hour, Ronan said. 1 hour, Patricia confirmed. He called Carla Ibsen in Great Falls, who had already reviewed Dr. Obi's assessment and the county's determination and the regional director's exemption refusal and had prepared a written argument that she described as tight, which in lawyer language meant that she believed in it without being willing to promise anything. She'd be at the courthouse at 7:30. She'd have everything she needed. She wanted Ronan there in person because judges responded to the human presence of invested parties, and Ronan was currently the most invested party available. He called Doyle. "Court at 8, he said. "I need to be in Dunn Creek." "Witt and Decker are already at May's property," Doyle said. "They started fencing an hour ago. They'll work through the night." "It won't matter if the court doesn't grant the stay." "It'll matter after," Doyle said. "We're building toward after." He called May Holloway directly because he hadn't spoken to her himself yet, and he needed to hear what she was. Her voice was careful and tired, and held the particular quality of someone trying to expand their capacity for obligation in real time. She was 58. She'd worked as a school secretary for 22 years. She'd met Wren twice, both times at George Holloway's place years ago when Wren was 2 or 3, and May had visited out of a distant familial sense of duty rather than closeness. She'd said yes to the placement because saying no had seemed impossible, and she'd said it before she fully understood what it entailed, and now she was trying to catch up. "The dogs," Ronan said. "Tell me honestly, does it scare you?" A pause. "They're large animals," she said. "I don't know dogs well. Scout won't hurt you. Briggs won't either. They're trained to protect Wren, which means they identify threats, and you won't register as a threat to them after 20 minutes. But they need space. They need to be able to move. If they're confined in a way that makes them feel trapped. The men building the fence," May said. "The men from Billings, they're building it right." "They are." A silence. Then, "I said yes because George would have wanted someone to say yes," she said. "I'm not doing this because I feel confident. I'm doing it because it's right." Another pause. "Tell me what I need to know about those dogs." He talked to her for 20 minutes. When he hung up, he went back to the porch and stood beside Cole and looked at the lantern glow in the enclosure and tried to calculate what tomorrow looked like if Judge Harold Crane said no. He couldn't build a plan around it. Some things you had to not plan. Some things you had to walk toward without the architecture of a backup position, because building a backup position meant accepting the possibility of needing it, and some possibilities you couldn't afford to install in your operating assumptions. "Cole," he said. "Yeah. In the morning. If the court doesn't grant the stay and the county comes at 9, "Don't finish that sentence," Cole said. "I need you to understand what I'm considering." "I said don't finish it." Cole's voice was quiet and entirely serious. "You're not going to do something that puts you outside the law. You understand why?" "Because it would give them grounds to deny any future placement claim." "Because it would give them grounds," Cole said. "And because it would prove Garrett right about what happens when one man makes decisions nobody voted on." He turned from the rail to look at Ronan directly. "You go to court. You let Ibsen work. You let Patricia work. You let the system have its shot before you decide the system can't be trusted." Ronan looked at him. "And if the system doesn't come through," he said. "Then we figure out the next thing," Cole said. "Together. Through channels that don't destroy what you're trying to build." A pause. "You know how this works. You've seen what happens when men like us go outside the law on emotional grounds. It never lands where we aim it." He wasn't wrong. Ronan knew he wasn't wrong. He went inside and lay down and did not sleep. At 3 a.m., his phone rang. The number was Doyle's, which was wrong. Doyle did not call at 3 a.m. unless something had happened that required immediate management. Ronan was sitting up before the second ring. "Talk," he said. Doyle's voice was level in the specific way that level voices are when something is cracked underneath them and the speaker is holding the surface steady through effort. "I need you to listen to all of this before you respond. Go." Marcus Garrett left Billings at 9 o'clock tonight. I didn't know until an hour ago. He told his wife he was going to the shop. He wasn't at the shop. A pause, precisely measured. At 11:45, Raymond Gill, the county caseworker, posted on his personal social media account, a private account that one of Patricia's contacts has access to, that he'd had an off-the-record conversation with a member of the Iron Vow Brotherhood who had expressed concerns about Ronan Voss's judgment and fitness for involvement with a vulnerable child. The room went very still around Ronan. "He named Voss specifically?" Ronan said. "He named the Brotherhood generally, and the connection to you specifically." Another pause. "The post has been deleted, but it was captured." Ronan stood up. He was in the dark farmhouse, standing in the middle of the room, and the cold came through the walls the way cold came through walls that had been fighting it for 50 years and were losing the argument by degrees, and he stood there processing what Doyle had just told him with the particular careful slowness of someone taking inventory of damage. "Garrett went to the caseworker," he said. "I believe so. He went to Raymond Gill and told him something about me. I don't know what he said. I know the contact exists. I know the timing. The night before your court appearance. The night before the 9 o'clock pickup. Whether it was intent or whether Garrett walked into something without understanding what it would do, he understood," Ronan said. His voice was flat. Not angry, past angry, into the territory that was colder and more deliberate than anger. "Garrett is not a stupid man." Silence. "No," Doyle said. "He's not." Ronan moved to the farmhouse window. Outside, the lantern in the enclosure had been turned off. Wren was asleep, Scout and Briggs positioned as they always positioned at night, and the enclosure was just dark shapes against a slightly lighter darkness, the rusted bars catching no light at all. "What does it do to the court appearance?" Ronan said. "If Jill submits something to the court record before 8, if he includes in his caseworker notes that a member of the Brotherhood raised fitness concerns about you, Ibsen walks into a different hearing than the one she prepared for. Can she adjust?" "She's adjusting right now. I called her at 2. A pause. "She needs to know what Garrett might have said, what he knows about you that he could use." The question landed like a stone dropping through still water. What Garrett knows about you. Marcus Garrett had been in the chapter for 11 years. He'd been present at meetings Ronan had attended where things were said that chapters said in rooms where only chapter members were listening. He knew Ronan's history. Not all of it, but the architecture of it. The contractor years, the places, the particular incident in year 3 of the contractor work that Ronan had disclosed to Doyle privately, and that Doyle, in the way of men who kept trust as a professional discipline, had kept, or Ronan had assumed he'd kept. "Doyle," he said, "what does Garrett know about Kandahar?" The silence was 3 seconds long. That was the answer. "He knows," Doyle said, not a question. "How?" "I don't know. I told no one. But men talk in proximity, Ronan. Over years. Over enough drinks, enough nights, enough—" Doyle stopped. "I don't know how. I know that I didn't tell him directly." Ronan sat down on the floor. He put his back against the wall and his elbows on his knees, and he looked at the space between his hands and thought about Kandahar. Not the place. The event. The one event out of 4 years of events that he had never been able to put in the same category as everything else. Not because it was the worst thing he'd witnessed, it wasn't, but because it was the one in which his choice had been the difference, and his choice had been wrong, and the wrongness of it had produced consequences he'd spent 14 years carrying in the particular way you carry something you can't put down, because putting it down means seeing what it looks like resting on the ground in full light. He'd been 29. He'd been a combat medic seconded to a unit not his own, a complex arrangement that had left his chain of command ambiguous in ways that mattered. A family, a man, his wife, 2 children, had been identified by local intelligence as providing shelter to a target. The unit had moved on the compound. Ronan had been with them in his medical capacity. What he'd found when they breached was not what the intelligence had described. What he'd found was exactly what it looked like: a family in a house. And he'd said so, clearly, into a radio. To men who had already committed to the outcome and were not receiving new information in the way that information was supposed to be received. Nobody had died. That was the fact he returned to when the event became unbearable. The family had been detained and questioned and released. Ronan's radio transmission had been noted in the debrief. But he'd been asked to sign a document that characterized his assessment as having been delivered after rather than before the breach, which would have made his transmission confirmatory rather than preventative, which would have changed the unit's accountability calculus in ways that protected certain careers. He hadn't signed it. He'd submitted his own incident report instead. The document had disappeared. His report had been filed without response or consequence. He'd been transferred within 30 days. He'd left the contractor work 18 months later, not directly because of the incident, but because the incident had made the work impossible in a way he couldn't fully articulate and hadn't tried to. What he'd never told anyone, except Doyle, in a conversation 3 years into the Brotherhood that he wished sometimes he could have back, was that in the seconds before he transmitted, he had hesitated. He'd held the radio. He'd calculated the cost of speaking against the cost of silence, and the calculation had taken 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, he'd been exactly the kind of person he'd spent his adult life trying not to be. He'd transmitted. He'd done the right thing, eventually. But the 4 seconds existed, and Marcus Garrett somehow knew about them. "What does he do with it?" Ronan said. "In a family court hearing about a child placement, what does Kandahar do?" "Alone, probably nothing," Doyle said. "Combined with the Brotherhood membership, the lack of stable housing. You've been on the road for 3 years, Ronan. You don't have a fixed address. Combined with the question of your relationship to this child, which by any outside read is a grown man with a complicated past who developed a strong attachment to a vulnerable child in 10 days. He stopped. Combined. It's a picture. It's not a fair picture. But it's a picture someone could paint. Garrett painted it. I don't know exactly what Garrett said to Jill. I know the contact happened. Where is he now? I don't know." Ronan was quiet for a long time. The wind pressed against the farmhouse walls. Outside, nothing moved. The dogs were still. The night was still. In a few hours, the sky would begin to lighten from the east, and he would have to put on his vest and ride to Dunn Creek and sit in a courthouse and hope that a judge named Harold Crane read documentation carefully and made decisions on its merits. And he would have to do that knowing that somewhere in the record, or in the caseworker's file, or in a deleted social media post that had been captured before deletion, there was a version of him that Marcus Garrett had constructed from the materials of 11 years of proximity. He called Garrett. The phone rang 8 times and went to voicemail. He called again. This time, on the 5th ring, Garrett picked up. The sound on the other end was the sound of a vehicle interior, engine running, heat on, somewhere on a road at 3 a.m. Garrett hadn't gone home after his conversation with Raymond Gill. He was still moving. "Where are you?" Ronan said. A pause. "Driving? Where? Does it matter?" "Marcus." He kept his voice level. "Tell me what you said to Jill." Another pause, longer. When Garrett spoke, his voice had the quality of someone who had made a decision and was standing in it rather than behind it. "I told him the truth." "What truth?" "That the chapter voted 7-3, that 3 men had concerns, that the concerns were about a member who'd made a unilateral decision that was pulling chapter resources into a personal situation nobody had been consulted on, that the member in question had a history that made his fitness for involvement with a vulnerable child worth examining." Ronan said nothing. "I didn't lie," Garrett said. "I told him what was true." "You went to a county caseworker the night before a court hearing," Ronan said. "You went outside the chapter. You went to a man who is professionally obligated to include what you told him in his case record." "I know what he's obligated to do." "Then you knew what you were doing." The silence was different now. Not the silence of a man choosing words, but the silence of a man who had already chosen them and was waiting to see what happened next. I've got 11 years in this chapter, Garrett said. 11 years of watching what happens when we let individuals pull us into their personal situations because the situation is emotional and the individual is someone we care about. I've seen it go wrong. I've seen men lose everything because a chapter let loyalty override judgment. I'm not going to watch it happen again. This is a 6-year-old child, Ronan said. I know what she is. That's not the point. What is the point? The point, Garrett said, and his voice had a flatness to it now, something that had been heated and had cooled into a different shape, is that you stopped on a highway 10 days ago, and now the chapter is building fences in Cascade County in the middle of the night, and we have a lawyer in Great Falls who costs $400 an hour, and 3 men who should have been on a weekend run are sleeping in a field next to a construction site, and nobody voted on any of it. Nobody chose this. You chose it. And now we're all in it. You're right, Ronan said. That stopped Garrett. What? You're right about the process, Ronan said. I didn't vote. I didn't consult. I made a decision on a highway, and I brought the chapter into it because I needed the chapter, and I didn't ask first. You're right about all of that. He paused. And it doesn't change what I did, or why. And I would do it again. A long silence. I know you would, Garrett said. There was something under the flatness now, something older and less managed. That's the problem. Marcus, what did you tell Jill about Kandahar? The silence was very long. I told him, Garrett said slowly, that you had a complicated history from your contractor years, that you'd been involved in a situation that raised questions about your judgment under pressure. I didn't give him specifics. I don't have specifics. I have what I've... He stopped, started again. I've heard things. Over years. Pieces. Pieces, Ronan said. Yes. And you handed Jill pieces. I handed Jill information I believed was relevant to a decision being made about a child. Ronan stood up from the floor. He was moving now, slow and deliberate, toward the farmhouse door. He opened it and stepped onto the porch in the 20-degree air, and he stood there in the dark with the phone pressed to his ear, and he looked at the enclosure where Wren was sleeping, and he let the cold work on him for a moment because the cold was clarifying in a way that nothing else available to him was. You don't have specifics, Ronan said. You have pieces, and you gave pieces to a caseworker and called it truth. I called it relevant information. Relevant information about something you don't actually know. A pause. I know enough, Garrett said. You know what you assembled from secondhand proximity over 11 years. Ronan's voice was quiet, not shaking, past shaking. You don't know what happened. You don't know what I did or what I didn't do or what it cost. You have the shape of it without the content, and you handed that to a man who is going to include it in a file that a judge will read in 5 hours. Silence. Come back to Billings, Garrett said. Don't go to the hearing. Let Patricia's lawyer handle it without you in the room. Your presence is a liability, and you know it. She needs someone there. Wren doesn't know who's in the courthouse. She knows who's at the ranch. Cole's at the ranch. Don't tell me. I'm telling you what I know about family court, Garrett said, and his voice shifted again, something Ronan hadn't expected, something that sounded like information rather than argument. I know, because I've been in one. I know because 14 years ago I sat in a family court hearing with a lawyer and I lost something I should have kept, and the reason I lost it was because I was in the room and my presence was the most damaging thing available to the other side. A long pause. The engine sound on his end. The road. I know what it looks like when the right outcome depends on you not being the centerpiece. The porch beneath Ronan's boots, the cold in his hands. You went to Gil, Ronan said, even knowing this. I went to Gil because I was angry, Garrett said, and it was the first time in the conversation his voice had admitted to anything. Because I was angry, and because I thought, I still think, the chapter was being pulled somewhere without consent. And yes, I did something with that anger that He stopped. That I need to think about. It wasn't an apology. It was the edge of one, the outline of one. The place where an apology might eventually be standing once a man like Marcus Garrett had worked his way through the architecture of what he'd done and arrived at its costs. Ronan didn't need it yet. Stay on the phone, he said. He called Carla Ibsen on his second phone. He carried two, a habit from contractor years, and woke her and told her about Garrett's conversation with Jill. He told her what Garrett had disclosed in the terms Garrett had described. Complicated history, contractor years, judgment questions, no specifics. He told her it would likely appear in Gill's case notes, possibly flagged to the judge's attention before the hearing. Ibsen was quiet for 12 seconds. "Is there anything in that history," she said carefully, "that is documentable and damaging?" "There's something that was investigated and closed without finding," Ronan said. "There's something that could be framed in a way that looks bad without being accurate. Can you get me the documentation of closure?" "I can try." "Try tonight." A pause. "And Voss?" "The caseworker." "Jill. How did he seem to you?" "When you met him?" Ronan thought about Raymond Gill standing in front of the enclosure with his tablet and his travel mug, looking at Wren with an expression that was professionally calibrated, and underneath the calibration, something that might have been a person responding to what they were seeing. "He's in a system," Ronan said. "He's not the system." "Good," Ibsen said. "That's something. Get me the documentation." He spent the next 90 minutes on his laptop. The old tough book he kept in the right saddlebag, built for field conditions, scratched beyond cosmetic hope but functional, pulling together everything he had from the contractor period. The transfer paperwork. The incident report he'd submitted. The notation in his file that the report had been received. The absence of any adverse finding. These were not exonerating documents because there had been nothing to exonerate. He'd done the right thing, imperfectly but correctly, and the record said exactly that. He forwarded everything to Ibsen at 4:53 a.m. He put the tough book away. He went back to the porch. Cole was still there. He'd been there the whole time, silent and present in the way of a man who has learned that his job is sometimes just to be a body in a space that shouldn't be empty. "Garrett?" Cole said. "Yes." "How bad?" "Bad enough." Ronan leaned against the porch rail. He had reasons. Good reasons. Ronan thought about 14 years ago, about a family court hearing, about something Garrett should have kept and didn't, about the edge of an apology that lived in the outline of a man who had acted from anger and was beginning to understand the shape of what that meant. "Human reasons," Ronan said. Cole looked at him. "You're not going to burn him," Cole said. "Not a question. I'm going to deal with him later. Tonight I need to focus on the hearing." A pause. "You're going to the hearing?" "Yes." Ibsen's concern, "I'm not going to sit in a waiting room while they decide her life in a room I'm not in." Ronan's voice was flat and final. "I'll take the liability." "It's my liability to take." Cole said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who understood the decision even if he wouldn't have made it, which was the kind of respect that meant more than agreement. They stood together on the porch until the sky began to change in the east. Not dramatically, the sun didn't announce itself in October. It simply arrived, a gradual lessening of dark that preceded the light by long enough to feel like a warning. The temperature dropped one final degree before beginning, very slowly, to recede. Inside the enclosure, Wren stirred. Scout raised his head. Briggs shifted her weight and pressed herself against Wren's side, and Wren's hand, even in that half-waking state, moved immediately to find the dog's flank, as if her sleeping self had been monitoring the contact all night, and the waking self was just checking the connection she'd already known was there. Ronan watched this. He watched her sit up, slowly, pulling the blankets around her in the cold morning air, and he watched her look at the farmhouse, and he watched the moment she registered that the light in the window was on, and that he was on the porch, and that the world was continuing. She looked at him. He lifted a hand. She looked at him for a long moment, in the early gray light, with Scout against her side and Briggs under her hand, and he saw something in her face that he'd seen there before. Not in these 10 days, but in a photograph, in a memory, in every face he'd ever encountered that had organized itself around the calculus of survival and was trying to remember whether hope was a tool or a liability. He would go to the courthouse. He would stand in front of Judge Harold Crane, and Carla Ibsen would present what she had, and Raymond Gill would present what he had. And somewhere in the Custer County case file, There would be a notation derived from Marcus Garrett's conversation that would attempt to paint a picture of a man who couldn't be trusted near a vulnerable child. And either the judge would see through it or he wouldn't. And if he didn't, Ronan's phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. He looked at it. 3 words and an address. We need to talk. Raymond Gill. The address was a diner in Dunn Creek. 7 a.m. 2 hours before the hearing. 1 hour before he was supposed to meet Ibsen at the courthouse. Ronan read the text twice. He showed it to Cole. Cole read it, and his jaw tightened, and he looked at the horizon and then back at Ronan. It could be anything, Cole said. Yes. It could be him covering himself, getting your statement on record before the hearing so he has, yes. Or it could be, I know what it could be, Ronan said. Cole looked at him. You're going. Yes. I'm coming. You're staying here. Ronan looked at the enclosure, at Wren, who was now fully awake, pouring water from the container for the dogs with the careful, practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times. She can't wake up and find the porch empty. Cole held his gaze. Then you call me the second you walk in, and you leave the line open. Cole, the second you walk in, Cole said, and his voice had the quality it got when he was not making a request. I need to hear the room. Ronan got on his bike. The Harley turned over in the dark, the exhaust loud and immediate in the cold morning silence, and he sat for a moment with his hands on the bars, feeling the engine's vibration move through him from palms to shoulders, the familiar frequency of the machine that had been the only consistent thing in his life for 6 years. He looked at the enclosure one more time. Wren had stopped pouring water. She was looking at him. Scout and Briggs both had their heads up, their bodies angled toward the bike, the posture of animals that had learned to monitor departures. He held her gaze. She gave a very small nod, the kind of nod that meant, I see you going. I'll be here when you come back. Don't make that mean something different than it means. He rode out into the dark. The diner in Dunn Creek was called Paulette's, and it had been there since 1987, and it smelled like coffee and bacon grease and the particular warmth of a small building that was heated by the collective presence of people who came to it before dawn because mornings were better with somewhere to be. Raymond Gill was in a corner booth. He was not in his fleece vest. He was in jeans and a flannel shirt, and he had a coffee in front of him that he'd been working on for long enough that it was half gone. He looked like a man who'd slept badly and woken earlier than planned, and had driven somewhere because staying in the same place as his own thoughts had become untenable. Ronan sat across from him without being invited to. They looked at each other. You reached out, Ronan said. I did. Why? Jill turned the coffee cup in his hands. He had thick fingers, the hands of someone who'd worked physically at some point in his life before the desk. I got a call last night, he said, from a member of your club. I know. That surprised him. You know. I know who called you. I know what he told you, or approximately what. Ronan leaned forward slightly. What I don't know is what you're going to do with it. Jill looked at his coffee. He told me about Afghanistan, about a situation that raised questions about your judgment. He told you about pieces of a situation. He doesn't have the full picture. I do. And the full picture has a documented record that shows an incident investigated and closed without adverse finding. Ronan kept his voice even. I can show you the documentation. I don't need documentation, Jill said. Ronan looked at him. I've been doing this job for 16 years, Jill said. I've had people try to hand me pictures of other people more times than I can count. I know what it looks like when someone's painting a picture versus when they're giving me facts. He looked up. The man who called me, Garrett, he was painting a picture. I could hear it. The careful phrasing, the I'm not saying, but, the you might want to consider. That's not a person giving me information. That's a person with an agenda. The booth was very quiet around them. The diner sounds from the counter, coffee pouring, plates settling, the low morning murmur of people not yet fully committed to their days, seemed to come from a different distance. I'm still going to include the contact in my case notes, Jill said. I have to. It's in my notes that the contact happened. I can't omit a contact. He paused. But I have discretion in how I characterize the information provided. and I have discretion in what I include in my formal recommendation." Ronan looked at him. "I went to that ranch," Jill said, "because I had a report about a child in an unsafe situation. What I found was—" He stopped, turned the cup again. "I found a situation that looked like neglect and wasn't. I found a child who looked like a victim and wasn't. Not exactly. And I found a man sleeping on a porch in October." He looked up. "That man could have called it in and left. He didn't." "No," Ronan said. "Why not?" The question sat between them. Ronan thought about how to answer it. He thought about George Holloway's handwriting, the large, unsteady letters, the entry about trust. He thought about the sound of a child humming to herself in a cage because the world outside it hadn't earned entry yet. "Because she wasn't scared of me," he said. Jill looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not opposing the stay," Jill said. "I'm going to submit a recommendation that the emergency placement be delayed pending the accommodation review. That the dogs are clinically significant to the child's stability. I'm basing that on Dr. Obi's assessment and on my own observational notes." A pause. "That's not a guarantee of how Judge Crane rules, but it's what I'm submitting." Ronan was very still. "Why?" he said. "Because I've got 32 cases," Jill said. "And in 32 cases, I am almost always processing human beings through a system that was designed for categories and not for people. And once in a while—" He stopped, picked up the coffee, set it down. "Once in a while, I get to see what actually happened, what was actually there. And in those cases, I try to tell the truth about what I saw." He stood up. He put enough money on the table for both coffees and his own breakfast, though he hadn't eaten. "The hearing's at 8, he said. "I'll see you there." He left. Ronan sat in the booth for 30 seconds. He picked up his own coffee, which was still hot, and drank half of it in 2 long swallows. He looked out the diner window at the parking lot where his Harley sat in the early morning light, chrome catching the first gray pink of a Montana dawn. He called Cole. "It's okay," he said. "Jill?" "He's submitting a recommendation for the stay." A pause. "Garrett's call backfired." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, "Wren's awake. She's asking where you are." "Tell her I'm coming back." "When?" Ronan looked at the parking lot, at the dawn, at the road that led to the courthouse where Judge Harold Crane would read Raymond Gill's recommendation and Carla Ibsen's argument and the documentation of a life that had been, in most of its crucial moments, trying to be the right thing even when the process of trying had been slow and imperfect and accompanied by 4 seconds of hesitation that Ronan would carry forever, regardless of what anyone decided today. "After," he said. "Tell her after." He paid for the coffees and walked out into the cold. The Harley started on the first try. He rode toward the courthouse through a Montana dawn that offered no promises, only light, and he thought about what Raymond Gill had said. "Once in a while, I get to see what actually happened, what was actually there." What was actually there was a child in a cage who had never once asked to be rescued. She'd asked for consistency, for someone who stayed, for a man who came back. He was coming back. But first, Judge Harold Crane. First, the room where it would be decided whether the system could, just this once, see what was actually there. And if it couldn't, if Crane looked at the documentation and the recommendation and the argument Ibsen had spent all night building and still said no, then Ronan Voss would walk out of that courthouse and do something he had not done in 6 years. He would ask the chapter to go somewhere the chapter had never officially gone. He would ask 12 men to become something they'd never officially been. He would cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed, not because he'd run out of options, but because some options stopped being options the moment you looked through rusted bars at a child who was counting the distance between herself and whatever came next by whether your bike was still parked in front of the farmhouse. And Marcus Garrett would be right about the precedent, and Ronan would carry that too. He hit the throttle. The dawn opened up ahead of him like a door someone had left ajar, and he rode toward it with everything he had, which wasn't much, but which was, he had decided, somewhere on a porch at 3 a.m. in a Montana winter, enough. Judge Harold Crane read for 11 minutes without looking up. The courtroom was small. Dunn Creek was not a city. Its courthouse was not built for drama. It had wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting that buzzed at a frequency just below the threshold of conscious notice, and a gallery that sat 12 people and currently held 6: Ronan, Carla Ibsen, Raymond Gill, a county attorney named Marsh, who had nothing to do with Doyle and everything to do with institutional procedure, Patricia Cross in the back row, and Marcus Garrett. Garrett had come. Ronan had seen him when he walked in. Garrett was in the second-to-last row, clean-shaven, jacket buttoned, sitting with the stillness of a man who had arrived somewhere difficult and decided to stay. He hadn't looked at Ronan. Ronan hadn't looked at him long enough to require acknowledgement. They'd occupied the same room the way two weather systems occupied the same sky, aware of each other, not yet intersecting. Ibsen had reviewed Gill's submitted recommendation before the hearing opened. She'd read it twice, her face doing nothing, and then she'd turned to Ronan and said very quietly, "He wrote it straight." That was all. That was enough. Crane set the documents down. He was a compact man, 61, with reading glasses he hadn't removed and the particular economy of movement that accumulated in judges who had learned that everything they did in a courtroom was being watched and measured. He looked at Gill first. "Mr. Gill, your recommendation is for a 72-hour stay of emergency placement pending animal accommodation review." "Yes, Your Honor." "On the basis of clinical necessity as documented by Dr. Adeyeze Obi." "Yes." Crane looked at the county attorney. "Ms. Marsh, the county's position." Marsh was 40, precise, the kind of attorney who operated on procedure rather than feeling, and was not wrong to do so. The county's position is that standard protocol requires placement within the emergency timeline. The county acknowledges Dr. Obi's assessment, but maintains that animal attachment, however significant, does not constitute clinical necessity under the relevant statute. Crane looked at Ibsen. "Counselor?" Ibsen stood. She was 53 and had the particular authority of someone who had stopped needing to perform confidence because the real version had long since replaced the performed version. "Your Honor, Dr. Obi's assessment documents not animal attachment but regulatory function. The dogs in question do not comfort the child. They regulate her. The distinction is clinical and it is documented with specificity. Removing the dogs within the emergency timeline is not relocating a child. It is removing the only functional nervous system regulation available to her and placing her in a new environment simultaneously. The psychological cost of that compounded disruption is measurable, and Dr. Obi has measured it." Crane looked at the documents again. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Ronan's hands were flat on his thighs. He could feel his pulse in his palms. He was breathing in the deliberate pattern he'd learned in the field. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The body's emergency override for situations in which emotion was information but couldn't be the driver. Crane looked up. "I'm granting the stay," he said. 72 hours, animal accommodation review to be completed within that window, or a further hearing will be scheduled." He looked at Jill. "I want Dr. Obi's assessment in the permanent record." "Yes, Your Honor." The child remains at the current location with the current," he checked his notes, "associate present until placement is confirmed to include the animals." He looked at Ibsen. "Counselor, your client should understand this is a stay, not a determination. The placement will proceed." "Understood, Your Honor." Crane stood. The room stood. Crane left. Ronan exhaled. It was a sound he hadn't planned and couldn't have stopped. 4 seconds of compressed air leaving his body in a single controlled release, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch, his hands unclenching from the position they'd held without his noticing. Ibsen turned to him. 72 hours, she said. "Witt and Decker. They've been working since midnight. Call them." He called Doyle instead because Doyle was closer to Witt and Decker, and because Doyle's voice on the other end of a phone call in a moment like this was a specific kind of anchor. He told Doyle in 12 words. Doyle's response was 4 words. "I'll tell the boys," and hung up. Ronan stood in the emptying courtroom. Patricia Cross touched his arm as she passed. No words, just the brief pressure of a hand that said, "I was here. I saw it. It mattered." Jill was gathering his documents near the county attorney's table. Ronan walked to him. Jill looked up. "Thank you," Ronan said. Jill looked at him for a moment. "I wrote what I saw," he said. "That's all." "I know." A pause. That's not nothing. In this situation, that's not nothing at all. Jill nodded. He picked up his tablet. He walked out. Ronan turned. Garrett was still in the gallery. He hadn't moved during any of this. He was sitting with his hands folded on the bench in front of him, looking at the empty judge's bench, his face doing something complicated that Ronan had never seen on it before. Ronan walked to the second-to-last row and sat down beside him. They sat there in the empty courtroom for a moment without speaking. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Outside, through the single window, the Montana morning had arrived fully. Clear, cold, indifferent. "You came," Ronan said. "I came." "Why?" Garrett was quiet for a moment. "Because I needed to see whether what I did mattered in the way I thought it was going to." A pause. "It didn't." "No." "Jill wrote it straight anyway." "Yes." Garrett's jaw moved. "That means what I did, it didn't—" He stopped. "It didn't change the outcome. It just created damage." "In the chapter," Ronan said, "between us." "Yes." The fluorescent lights buzzed. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," Ronan said. "It's not fine. What you did goes outside. You know the rule." "I know the rule." "So you know what comes next." Garrett looked at the judge's bench. "I know what comes next." He was quiet for a moment. "I'd do it differently. If I could." He paused. "Not the principle. The method." "I know," Ronan said. "You know?" "I know you'd do it differently. I know the principle was real." Ronan looked at him. "You were right about the process. You were wrong about the action. Those two things can both be true." Garrett looked at him. Something in his face loosened. Not much, not dramatically, just the particular degree of loosening that happened when a man who'd been braced for one kind of response received a different one. 14 years ago, Garrett said. "My son, the court hearing. How did you—" "You mentioned it on the phone," Ronan said. "You didn't name it, but you described it." Garrett looked away. "I lost the hearing because I was in the room, my record. Things that looked bad without context." He stopped. "I thought I was protecting you from the same thing, with ammunition you handed to the other side." "Yes." A pause. "I know." Ronan stood. "Come to the ranch," he said. "This afternoon, after." Garrett looked up at him. "After the fencing's done," Ronan said. "After the accommodation review, come see what you voted against." He held Garrett's gaze. "Then we talk about what comes next for you and the chapter, face to face. No intermediaries." Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Ronan walked out of the courthouse into the cold Montana air. His phone rang before he reached the bike. Doyle. Which was wrong. Doyle had just hung up 8 minutes ago. "Talk," Ronan said. "Whit found something." Doyle's voice had the quality it got when the thing being said required careful handling. "At the property, at May Holloway's." "What kind of something?" "A document. In the shed on the property, old, waterproofed in a sealed case so it kept." A pause. "It's George Holloway's. His name's on it. Ronan. It's a will, formal, notarized, dated 3 years ago." The parking lot, the cold, the Harley in front of him. "A will," Ronan said, "naming a guardian for Wren." Everything stopped. "Who?" Ronan said. The pause was 2 seconds long and felt like a door opening onto a room he hadn't known existed. "May Holloway," Doyle said. He named May, but there's a secondary designation, a conditional clause, in the event May was unable or unwilling to take guardianship. Another pause. "The secondary designation is a woman named Kathleen Voss, Ronan. Kathleen Voss, Billings, Montana." The ground did not move. The ground felt like it moved. "That's my sister," Ronan said. "I know," Doyle said. "That's why I'm calling." Ronan's hand was tight on the phone. The other hand found the Harley's handlebar without his telling it to, the body seeking the familiar thing before the mind caught up. "George Holloway knew my sister," he said. It was not a question. It was a man watching a pattern assemble itself from pieces that had seemed random. "Kathleen is trying to reach you," Doyle said. "She's been trying since last night. Her number. She doesn't have my current number. She called the shop. She called the chapter line. She got me at 7 this morning." A pause. "She says she knew George Holloway. She says she's been trying to find out what happened to Ren since she heard he passed. She didn't know about the ranch. She didn't know about you being there." The pause was very specific now. "She didn't know you were the one who found her." The cold, the parking lot, the courthouse door behind him, a dying man in a composition notebook writing about trust, writing about a future stranger with enough broken in them to understand what they were looking at. George Holloway had not been writing to a stranger. He had been writing to someone in a world that was smaller than it looked, in a state where people's lives crossed and recrossed in ways that the distances between them suggested was impossible. He had been writing to whoever came, yes, but he had also, 3 years ago, written a name into a legal document, a specific name, a woman in Billings, a sister of a man who rode a dark Harley on a highway 40 miles from a ranch where a little girl was waiting. "Ronan," Doyle's voice. "You there?" "I'm here." "What do you need?" He stood in the cold parking lot of the Dunn Creek courthouse with the phone pressed to his ear and the sky above him doing nothing, offering nothing, just existing in its enormous indifferent blue. And he thought about a little girl who had organized her entire surviving self around the belief that the people who left came back. He thought about a man on a porch in October, reading stories through rusted bars until a child fell asleep. He thought about a composition notebook and a woman named Kathleen, and a legal document sealed in a shed waiting 3 years to be found by a retired contractor doing fencing work in the middle of the night. He thought about what it meant that he had stopped on that highway. Not fate. He didn't believe in fate. He believed in the accumulation of decisions, the places you rode, the roads you took, the speed you traveled when you were tired and running late, and a dog at the side of a road made you pull over because the medic's reflex fired before the man could stop it. He thought about Scout's eyes, old eyes that had been waiting for the right person to assess and approve. "Get me Kathleen's number," he said, "and get Ibsen on the phone. The will changes the legal landscape." He paused. "And Doyle." "Yeah. Tell Witt and Decker not to stop." His voice was steady. Completely, entirely steady, which was a different thing than calm. "Tell them to finish the fencing, whatever it takes, tonight." He got on the Harley. The engine fired. The sound of it echoed off the courthouse wall and came back to him, familiar and absolute. The specific frequency of a machine that had been the only constant in his life for 6 years, and was only now, today, beginning to feel like it had been carrying him somewhere, rather than simply carrying him. He pulled out of the parking lot. He had 72 hours. He had a sister who knew a dead man. He had a judge's stay and a lawyer who didn't sleep, and a chapter full of men who had voted 7-3 to be somewhere they'd never officially been. He had a little girl waiting on the other side of 60 miles of Montana highway who had learned to count consistency by whether the bike was still parked in front of the farmhouse. He opened the throttle. The courthouse disappeared behind him. The road opened up ahead, long, straight, utterly without mercy, the kind of road that asked everything of you and offered nothing back except the horizon, which kept moving, which kept existing, which was, in the end, the only promise the road ever made. He rode toward it. And somewhere in Billings, in an apartment he didn't know the address of, his sister was trying to reach a phone number she didn't have, to tell a brother she hadn't spoken to in 2 years something that was going to change every calculation he thought he'd already made. And somewhere on a ranch 40 miles east, a little girl was sitting with her back against rusted bars and her hand on a dog's flank, watching the road. Waiting. Kathleen Voss was waiting at the ranch when he got back. He hadn't told her to go there. She'd gotten the address from Doyle and she'd driven 2 hours from Billings, and she was standing near the farmhouse porch when his Harley came down the gravel track. And she looked exactly like he remembered, and not at all like he remembered, which was what 2 years of not seeing someone did, preserved them in amber and changed them simultaneously. She was 51. She had his same gray in her hair now, the same set to her jaw. She'd been a veterinary technician for 26 years, and she carried that work in her hands, in the way she assessed physical situations with her eyes before she spoke. She was looking at the enclosure when he cut the engine. She stood very still for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him, and something crossed her face that wasn't surprise and wasn't relief, and was something older and more complicated than either. "You found her," she said. "You knew George," he said, "for 9 years." She looked back at the enclosure. At Wren, who was watching this new person with the standard assessment, Scout positioned as always. "He brought a dog to the clinic where I worked, 6 years ago now. Old retriever, bad hip. We talked while I did the intake. He came back every month for the dog's follow-up." She paused. "He was the kind of person you talk to, Ronan. You know the kind. You just talk to them. He named you in a will." He named me as the secondary contact for Wren, in case May couldn't take her. She looked at him. "He told me about her, about the situation. He never asked me directly. He wasn't the kind to ask directly. He just told me." She stopped. "I didn't know it was in a legal document until this morning." Ronan looked at her. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. 2 years ago. A year ago. Any time you knew this man and knew his situation?" "Because we weren't talking," she said. Flat, true. "Because 2 years ago you drove away from a conversation we needed to have, and you didn't come back. Because I have a phone number for you that's been disconnected since 18 months ago." She held his gaze. "Because you disappeared, Ronan. You do that. You've been doing it since you came home." The wind moved between them. He didn't defend it. There was nothing to defend. It was accurate in the way that hard things were accurate. Without malice, without editorializing, just a fact sitting in the open air waiting to be acknowledged. "I know," he said. "I know you know." She exhaled. "I'm not here for that argument. I'm here because there's a little girl in a cage and George Holloway trusted me enough to put my name in a document, and whatever's happening between you and me has to wait." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the enclosure. Wren was still watching them. She had not looked away through any of this exchange. She was reading it, the body language, the proximity, the particular tension of two people who carried history between them, with the careful attention of someone who had learned that the relationships between adults were a form of weather that determined her conditions. "Wren," Ronan said. "This is Kathleen. She's my sister." Wren looked at Kathleen. "Do you know about dogs?" Wren asked. Kathleen looked at her. "I work with animals every day," she said. "What's wrong with Briggs's leg?" "I'd have to look at it. May I?" A pause. Scout's assessment, the moment of decision that only Wren fully controlled. "Yes," Wren said. Kathleen crouched down. She looked at Briggs's leg through the bars with the same focused calm she brought to every animal. No drama, no performance, just attention. She asked Wren 3 questions about the injury. Wren answered each one with precision. Kathleen made 2 observations that were clinically accurate and that Wren confirmed, and in the space of 4 minutes, something shifted in the enclosure. Some degree of the watchfulness Wren maintained toward new people lowered by 1 increment. Ronan stood back and watched. He thought about a will in a sealed case in a shed, about a man who had talked to his sister in a veterinary clinic for 9 years, about the particular size of Montana and the particular size of the circles that people moved in within it, and how those circles crossed and recrossed until what looked like accident looked like something else. He still didn't call it fate. He called it the accumulation of decisions. George Holloway had decided to take a dog to a clinic. Kathleen had decided to talk to him. George had decided, quietly, over years, to put a name in a document. Kathleen had decided 2 years ago to have a conversation that Ronan had walked away from. Ronan had decided to stop on a highway in October because of dogs. Every decision had led here. The accommodation review happened on the 2nd day of the stay. The reviewer was a woman named Sandra Cho, who worked for the District Animal Services Office and had the practical, unimpressed demeanor of someone who had seen every possible configuration of human and animal living arrangement and had developed a rubric that accounted for most of them. She spent 40 minutes at May Holloway's property. She walked the fencing that Witt and Decker had completed in 38 hours of continuous work. She assessed the dog run, the indoor space, the yard dimensions. She approved it in 11 minutes of paperwork. May Holloway stood in her doorway watching the pen move across the forms, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had said yes to something enormous and was only now beginning to understand the shape of it, and finding that the shape was, if not comfortable, then possible. Ronan was there. Kathleen was there. Doyle had driven down that morning and stood near his truck with his hands in his jacket pockets, saying nothing, being present in the way that Doyle had always been present, as ballast, as witness, as the gravity that kept things from flying apart. When Sandra Cho left, May looked at Ronan. "The dogs," she said. "Tell me again what they need." He told her, all of it, from Wren's notebook, from 3 days of observation. May listened with the focused attention of someone memorizing a language they were going to need immediately. She asked 2 questions. She wrote something in a small notebook she'd produced from her cardigan pocket. "Okay," she said. Then she looked at the yard. The fencing, the dog run, the 2 dog beds that someone had delivered that morning, ordered by a chapter member whose name Ronan didn't know and hadn't asked because the chapter had stopped requiring attribution for anything in the previous 72 hours. "It looks right," she said, quietly. "It looks like somewhere something could live." Tights. The day of the move was a Thursday, clear, cold, the kind of October day that apologized for nothing and offered everything. Hard blue sky, clean air, the mountains to the northwest sharply present, in a way they only were when the atmosphere had nothing left to hide behind. Cole drove the car. Ronan rode behind it. Wren sat in the back seat with Scout on her left and Briggs, leg healing, on her right. She'd left the enclosure voluntarily, which she hadn't told anyone she was going to do. She'd simply stood up, unlocked the door from the inside, and walked out with both dogs at her sides. She'd stood in the open air for a moment, looking at the field, at the farmhouse, at the distant line of the highway where a motorcycle had pulled over in October because a dog was hurt. She'd looked at Ronan. "Is this right?" she'd asked. "Yes," he said. "You'll come." "I'll come." She'd gotten in the car. Every few minutes on the drive, she looked through the rear window, checking. Ronan saw her do it, the small face turning, the check, the return to forward. He held his line directly behind the car. Every time she looked, the Harley was there. Dark navy fading toward black, chrome catching the October sun. The same bike, the same distance. He did not fall back. He did not pull ahead. He rode exactly where she needed him to be. May's house was warm in the way of a house that had been heated by someone who understood that warmth was not a luxury in Montana. There were curtains Ronan hadn't seen on his previous visits. New or newly hung, a yellow print that did something specific to the afternoon light. A bedroom that had been prepared for Wren with the deliberate care of someone who had no template for this and had therefore done everything she could think of. 2 dog beds beside hers. Wren stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a long time. Scout went in first, assessed the space, lay down on the larger bed, looked at Wren. Briggs went to the second bed, turned twice, settled. Wren looked at Ronan. He nodded. She went in. She sat on the edge of the bed, her bed, a real bed, not a folded blanket inside iron bars. And she looked at the window and at the dogs and at the curtains doing their work with the light. And something in her face did something he'd been waiting to see since the first morning he'd crouched in front of a rusted enclosure with a trauma kit. It let go. Not dramatically, not in the way of movies, not with tears or sound, just a very quiet letting go, the particular release of a small body that had been braced for a very long time and had finally, in this specific room, decided it was allowed to stop. Scout raised his head and looked at her. She put her hand on his head. She lay down on her side on the bed, with her hand still on the dog, and she closed her eyes, and within 4 minutes she was asleep. Ronan sat on May's porch with a coffee that May had made without asking whether he wanted one. Kathleen was inside, helping May understand the dog's feeding schedule. He could hear their voices through the window. Low, practical, the sound of 2 women working out a logistics of care. He hadn't heard Kathleen's voice this consistently in 2 years, and it was doing something to him that he was allowing to happen without examination. Doyle came out and sat in the second chair. They were quiet for a while. "Garrett called this morning," Doyle said. "I know, I called him back." "And?" "He's going to stand before the chapter," Ronan said. He knows what that means. And after? Ronan looked at the yard, the fencing, the dog run, the November sky beginning to darken in the northwest with the season's first real weight of winter coming down from the mountains. After is after, he said. I don't have an opinion yet. Doyle nodded. He drank his coffee. The notarized will changes the legal standing. Ibsen says May's position as guardian is secure. May said she wants it to be May. I know. That's the right outcome. I know that too. A pause. Your sister. Ronan looked at the door through which Kathleen had gone. 2 years, he said. Yeah. She was right about the thing we argued about. You going to tell her that? Already did, he said. In the car this morning while you weren't watching. Doyle almost smiled. Not quite. And? She said she knows. She's been knowing. She was waiting for me to know it too. He drank the coffee. It was strong and slightly overbrewed and tasted exactly like something a person made when they were trying to take care of someone else and doing their genuine best. The door opened and Cole came out. He stood against the porch rail with his own cup and looked at the yard. She's still asleep, he said. Good, Ronan said. Scout's on the floor next to the bed. Wouldn't get on the dog bed once she was on the mattress. Just moved to the floor. Cole paused. Like he was standing watch. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Cole said quietly, 43 days ago you were riding Route 9 alone. 43 days ago I was late to a chapter gathering, Ronan said. And now? And now I'm on a porch in Cascade County, drinking burnt coffee. How's it feel? Cole asked. Ronan looked at the yard, at the fencing that 12 men had built in 38 hours without asking for recognition, at the dog run and the 2 water bowls and the gate that latched properly because Decker had rebuilt it twice until it did, at the mountains in the northwest holding the last of the day's light along their ridges like something worth keeping. He thought about George Holloway on a porch in October, reading stories through rusted bars until a child fell asleep. He thought about the composition notebook, someone with enough broken in them to understand what they're looking at. He thought about Scout's eyes assessing him from the road shoulder and deciding, after a long moment, that he was the right kind of person. He thought about a little girl asking, "Will it work?" and him saying, "I'm going to make it work." It feels like something I didn't know I was riding toward, he said. Cole nodded. Doyle said nothing, which was the most agreement Doyle ever expressed. Inside the house, through the window, Kathleen laughed at something May had said. A real laugh, the unstartled kind, the kind that came from a person who'd been somewhere difficult and had arrived, for this moment, somewhere that wasn't. The wind came down from the mountains. It moved through the yard and across the porch and touched all 3 of them. Ronan with his coffee, Cole at the rail, Doyle in the second chair. And it was cold the way Montana in November was cold, which was completely, without apology, without the option of pretending otherwise. But the porch had a roof, and inside the house a child was sleeping. And the dogs were with her. And that was enough. That was at the end of 43 days and 1 highway and 2 dogs and a dying man's faith in the existence of the right kind of stranger. That was everything. This is an entirely fictional cinematic story created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, locations, and organizations depicted are wholly invented.